Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 74, Greco-Bactria, Land of a Thousand Cities. On the outskirts of Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan, 7 locals toiled under the blistering heat in the summer of 1867. Digging amidst the desert-like landscape, one Uzbek saw a metal protrusion emerging from its dusty enclosure. As he began to scrape away the detritus, the man realized that what he was uncovering was not merely a scrap of bronze or iron, but gold. It was a golden coin, measuring just over 2 inches in diameter and weighing nearly 6 ounces. Twice the size of an American $quarter and a €2 coin, the gold value alone of this specimen would command a price of $10,000 today. For a poor and often hungry laborer, the 19th century equivalent of the coin's worth would have been a princely sum indeed. A fight immediately broke out amongst the men. Of the 7 that walked out to the fields that day, only 2 remained standing. With blood-soaked daggers in one hand and the coin in the other, the pair made a pact to travel to Europe to sell their hard-won prize. In Paris, the Uzbek held a meeting with a prominent French numismatist, Gaston L. Furardin, who purchased the specimen for £1,000, approximately £115,000 today. Gaston in turn sold it to the Royal Collection of Napoleon III, the predecessor of the National Library of France, for an incredible £6,000, nearly $700,000 today. This is the story that we are told, at least by Gaston himself. Variations of this tale circulated throughout the 1860s and 1870s, but the sequence of events remains reasonably consistent, and the coin is housed in the Cabinet du Médailler to this very day. But why all the fuss and intrigue surrounding this piece of gold? On the front of the coin is a profile of a Hellenistic king, wearing a Boeotian-styled cavalry helmet adorned with a bull's ears and horns to signify divinity, and with a diadem upon his brow. On the reverse are 2 richly detailed horsemen, identified as divine twins Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, along with an inscription, "Of the great king Eucratides." Truly a spectacular find. This species of Eucratides, known as the Eucratidion, was the largest denomination of currency from the ancient world that has ever been discovered. Yet, it was just as important, if not more so, for its link to those that minted it. Stretching across much of Central Asia, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom had emerged during the Hellenistic period, following its secession from the Seleucid Empire during the mid-3rd century BC, and minted a series of spectacular coins that drew the eyes of both academics and treasure hunters alike. The acquisition of the Eucratidion coincided with the fever pitch of the coin-hunting movement, brought about by the political and social upheaval of the Great Game, fought between the British and Russian empires over Afghanistan and the surrounding areas, the lands formerly ruled by Eucratides. The world of the Greco-Bactrians and their successors, the Indo-Greeks, have captivated generations of historians and scholars down to the present day, some of whom have labeled Greek-controlled Central Asia and India as the Hellenistic Far East. These were the farthest limits of the world where Greek settlers and culture existed in any significant capacity, a consequence of the conquests of Alexander the Great and the work of his successors. Compared to most of the Hellenistic world, it is shocking to see how poor our evidence is for this region. Perhaps it is because of the scarcity of information, and no doubt the exotic allure of classical civilization thriving in Central and South Asia, that so much speculation and mythologizing has taken place, exacerbated by whatever hints that we do have. Our perception of the classical world, focused chiefly on the peoples and places of the Mediterranean, tends to situate Bactria on the distant periphery. Such is the nature of the sources, who were primarily Greeks and Romans interested in their own affairs. Yet ancient Bactria and Sogdiana can be described as the crossroads of Eurasia. They occupied a key position within a larger framework that saw the mixing of cultures and communities from the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, the Iranian heartland, the grasslands of the steppes, China, and India. Even with regards to the ancient world, the Hellenistic period is often subject to guesswork and limited information due to gaps in our sources. But to say that we have limited information on Greek Central Asia and India is to put it mildly. All the literary accounts of the Greco-Roman authors that mention Greco-Bactria and the Indo-Greek kingdoms amounts to roughly 7 pages of material. Most of it sporadic and too insufficient to create any serious chronology beyond a cursory narrative framework. The main sources we can draw upon include the historian Polybius of Megalopolis during the 2nd century BC, the geographer Strabo, writing in the time of the Emperor Augustus in the 1st century BC, the epitomizer Justin, summarizing an earlier universal history written by the Gallo-Roman Pompeius Trogus of the 1st century AD, and lastly bits from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written by an anonymous sailor describing the trade networks of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean during the 1st century AD. The ancient historians tend to focus on events in the Mediterranean, or at least events that were relevant. For example, both Strabo and Pompeius Trogus were primarily interested in the rise of Parthia, Rome's great Eastern imperial rival, whose origins are intimately tied with that of Greco-Bactria. Polybius only covers Bactria so long as it's relevant to the career of the Seleucid king Antiochus III. It is unknown if any writers of history emerge out of Greco-Bactria or the Indo-Greek kingdoms, for even if there was, none of their work has survived to the present. Despite this skeletal collection, the Hellenistic Far East is incredibly unique because we can rely on sources outside of the Greek and Roman tradition. Explorers commissioned by the emperors of Han China visited Bactria just after the collapse of Greek rule, their reports having survived in the writings of court historians. In fact, the fall of Greco-Bactria holds the distinction of being the first event in world history recorded by authors from both the Mediterranean and East Asia. We also possess a few Indian sources as well, most notably a philosophical dialogue between a Buddhist sage and an Indo-Greek ruler. A handful of inscriptions survive, with a few only recently discovered within the last 25 years. Archaeological evidence is scarce, and despite being the fabled land of 1,000 cities, the only significant settlement to have been found remains the city of Ai Khanoum in southeastern Afghanistan. Our most valuable tool in establishing chronology is undoubtedly numismatics, the study of coins. As seen in my introduction, Bactria was able to mint spectacular gold and silver coin specimens, easily some of the most impressive in the ancient world. Through the study of coins, die-casts, and hoard locations, we can piece together a list of kings along with an approximate spread of control and influence. If we were to rely exclusively on literary and epigraphical accounts, we would only be able to pinpoint the names of about 8 Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek rulers. Through recovered coinage, this number jumps to over 40. But without a steady written account running parallel to our coin finds, interpretations of who these men and women were are questionable at best. And at their worst, we get largely fictitious reconstructions of a ruler's personality and genealogy based on coin portraits alone. The use of coins have since moved beyond a checklist of rulers, and through careful analysis, they enable us to learn about the environment of Bactria and its inhabitants. To add to the problem, excavations and further investigation have been significantly hampered by instability and warfare in Central Asia over the past 50 years, particularly in Afghanistan. Black markets for historical artifacts have expanded operations as insurgent groups and poverty-stricken locals have taken advantage of distracted governments by plundering coin hoards and potential dig sites, dispersing these goods to collectors and buyers across the world. This isn't a recent phenomenon either. Such behaviors were common practice among prospective coin hunters during the 19th century, eager to sate the hunger of museums and coin aficionados who would pay great sums to acquire any scrap of Greek Asia that they could get their hands on. In the 20th century, tensions during the Cold War meant that access to much of Central Asia was largely limited to Soviet archaeologists, whose work was unavailable for, or not sought out by, scholars on the other side of the Iron Curtain. At the time of writing this series in mid-2021 through early 2022, the United States has just evacuated Afghanistan after 20 years of occupation, leaving the country in control of the Taliban, and Kazakhstan has witnessed severe civil unrest and protests. How this bodes for the future of research remains to be seen, but it does not appear to be an optimistic one. With a lack of sources and a unique geographical position, scholars have been divided as to how to view and interpret the Greeks of Asia from a historical perspective. William Woodthorpe Tarn, a British pioneer of Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek studies, titled his 1938 work, The Greeks in Bactria and India, asserting the primacy of the Greco-Bactrians' Hellenic identity, and wholeheartedly viewing it in the lens of classical studies rather than taking into consideration the role of either Indian or Central Asian civilizations. Writing almost 20 years after Tarn, the Indian scholar Awad Kishore Narayan published the landmark book, The Indo-Greeks, coining the term that we use to describe the kingdoms that survived in northwest India. Narayan firmly believed that the Indo-Greeks belong within the sphere of South Asian studies, downplaying the impact of Greek culture as ephemeral, and that rather than the Greeks Hellenizing the Indians, quote, the Greeks came, the Greeks saw, but India conquered. While both are remarkable contributions to the field, decades of new research and archaeological finds have greatly expanded our knowledge base about the Greco-Bactrians and Indo-Greeks alike, and challenge both of their core theses. As always, the truth is more complicated. This will be one of several episodes we spend on the Hellenistic Far East, a span of time covering from Alexander the Great's invasion of Bactria and India, ending at the rise of the Kushan Empire, a period of over 400 years. Given the paucity of sources, a simple retelling of events might be slightly underwhelming at best and utterly convoluted at worst. To compensate, I wish to go beyond a reconstructed chronology. Discussions about the nature of identity, analysis of artifacts and inscriptions, rigorous examination of ancient sources, all and more will be integral to this venture. Though the Asiatic Greeks will form the center around which this series is constructed, plenty of attention will be spent on the peoples they encountered and interacted with. In many cases, we'll be looking at their point of view, topics such as the interaction of Hellenistic society and Buddhism, the expeditions of the Chinese into Central Asia, and the migration of the Eurasian nomads. Supplementing this work will be a series of interviews with some of the foremost experts in the field. This is easily the most highly requested and ambitious show project to date, something that has filled me with both trepidation and excitement to plan and carry out. Because of the extensive number of notes and references that I've accumulated, I strongly encourage all listeners to look at the episode transcripts that I have made available, with links in the podcast descriptions and on my website directly. Now that we have finally arrived, I hope you enjoy our deep dive into Bactria, the land of 1,000 cities. To begin with, it is important that I give you an idea of the landscape that is included under the general umbrella term of the Hellenistic Far East. The borders of regions can only be talked about in the broadest sense during the ancient period, even more so given the lack of evidence. The geographic spread of the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms can be said to have covered from the edges of modern Kyrgyzstan, across Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and extended into northwest India. This includes major features such as the Eurasian steppe, the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, and the river systems of the Amu Darya and the Indus. This is an enormous swath of land, but let us cover the approximate location of each area, region by region. First is Sogdiana, also known as Sogdia. This is the northernmost extent of Greek rule, approximately covering Uzbekistan and parts of Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan, situated between the Amu Darya and Sirdarya rivers, what the ancients would call the Oxus and Gyxartes rivers respectively. The eastern part of Sogdiana includes the fertile lands of the Fergana Valley, a geological depression fed by tributaries of the Sirdarya and hemmed in by the Tian Shan and Pamir mountains. Sogdiana is bordered to the west by the Kizilkum Desert, but to the north are the great grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. The Sogdians themselves had an extremely close relationship with the nomadic tribes living along the steppes, and the region would become famous for its horse rearing. To the southwest of Sogdiana is the land of Margiana, encompassing most of Turkmenistan. Much of this territory is covered by vast sandy deserts or salt flats, such as the Karakum Desert, but settlements were clustered around oases like Merv. Travel in this territory necessitated the use of resilient pack animals, namely the famous Bactrian camels, the two-humped cousins of the one-humped dromedary of North Africa and Arabia. To the northwest of Margiana would be Parthia, roughly northern Turkmenistan and southern Kazakhstan. Bordered by the Caspian Sea to the east, the Kopet Dagh Mountains to the west, and the grasslands to the north, Parthia would be the natural corridor from the steppes into the Iranian plateau. Returning back to our starting position and located just south of Sogdiana, the core of Greek Central Asia would be Bactria, with much of the landscape including northern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and southern Uzbekistan. Bactria was considered the wealthiest and most agriculturally prosperous area. Its flat oases were supplemented by tributary systems that splintered from the Amu Darya, which bisected the land horizontally and marked its northern border with Sogdiana. Eastern Bactria was a combination of foothills and well-watered plains, enabling the growth of urban settlements and turning the area into a center of political and economic activity. The eastern flank was along the Badakhshan Mountains, a source of precious gems and important minerals such as the rich blue hue of lapis lazuli. The west, meanwhile, is flat, and not as densely populated due to its lack of supportive river systems. Its southern regions would be enclosed by the heights of the Hindu Kush, the gateway to India. Parapamisidae is poorly defined, as this is the name of the Persian satrapy, and little is known of its extent during Greek rule. Near Parapamisidae is Gandhara, the flat plains of the Kabul and Peshawar valleys that are surrounded by the mountains, with the Swat River to the north. Like with Bactria and the Oxus, the defining feature of Gandhara is the Indus River that cuts from north to south, with the Kabul River snaking its way eastward down the Hindu Kush, before emptying into the Indus. Once past the Indus, you are in northwestern India, with the later Indo-Greek rulers like Menander possibly campaigning as far as the lower Ganges to Pataliputra, modern Patna, before retiring to the Punjab and the land of the five rivers, the Indus, Hydaspes, Akesinos, Hydraotes, and Hyphasis, the modern Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, and Sutlej respectively. Turning southwest from Gandhara, we come to the region of Arachosia, extending across the Kandahar region of Afghanistan into Pakistan, perhaps as far as the Indus or the Bolan mountain pass. Arachosia did not remain in the hands of the Greeks for long, since it was quickly ceded to Chandragupta Maurya by Seleucus I in 303, but eventually was reconquered by the Greco-Bactrian rulers in the early 2nd century. West of Arachosia is Ariana, bordered by Bactria to its north, the Carmanian Desert to the west, and situated around the Afghan Hari-Rud River. Such is the approximate geographic organization of Hellenistic Central Asia and India, and please do check out the notes of this episode on my website for some helpful maps and images for guidance. With such a diversity of landscape, it is only fitting that the climate of Central and South Asia can be equally varied as well. In the mountainous areas, it can plummet to sub-zero temperatures, while some of the valleys and steppes can reach upwards of 45 to 50 degrees Celsius in the summertime. Aridity is a constant problem in Central Asia, and the amount of rainfall per year can be pathetically small, creating stretches of dry and dusty plains. Like with Egypt and the Nile, the communities of Bactria and Sogdiana were dependent upon the life-giving waters of the Amu Darya and Sir Darya. Fed mainly by snowmelt and mountainous streams, the inundation of the rivers could become a powerful tool for agriculturalists, provided that they put the effort to maintain the extensive irrigation systems that watered the oases and valleys. By contrast, the seasonality of the monsoons of India can cause lands to be divided into periods of desperate heat and drought, but then give way to a great deluge of rain by June or July that results in the transformation of arid scrub into a canopy of green. It is precisely because of the agricultural potential of the Oxus that we see the earliest signs of urbanization during the Bronze Age. The Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, known as BMAC for short, refers to a general classification for an urban civilization settled along the Oxus that emerged just before the turn of the 3rd millennium BC. A shared development of skilled metalworking and complex city structures, including the foundation of the city of Bactria in modern Balkh, mark this period. As early as 2200 BC, the region's key geographic position was attracting the attention of outside powers, and Bactria was soon integrated into the wider trading network of Eurasia. Outposts of the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization began appearing on the outer rims of the Badakhshan Mountains at Shortugai, presumably a trading post to get access to the lapis lazuli in the region. Afghanistan is also one of the only major sources of tin, one of the two components essential in the making of bronze, and thus of great value for the major powers of the Near East and Egypt throughout the Bronze Age. A symbiotic relationship would also develop between the settled Bactrians and the nomadic peoples of the steppes. Metal tools, jewelry, and weapons were traded for livestock and other animal products, such as horses. Following the end of the BMEC in the mid-2nd millennium, life in Bactria and Sogdiana remained largely unchanged. Various major powers could extend their influence from either India or the Iranian plateau, but the first confirmed foreign power to occupy the region would be the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The conquest of Bactria took place under the oversight of the founder of the empire, Cyrus the Great, as suggested by the later Darius I on the Behistun inscription of 520 BC. Among his description of the Persian satrapies, Herodotus lists it as the 12th district of the empire, providing a yearly payment of 360 talents of silver to the treasury of Persepolis. The reliefs adorning the walls of Persepolis proudly display Bactrians coming to pay their respects and offer tribute to the great king, notably accompanied by a Bactrian camel. Despite the grandiose boasting of Darius, little is actually known about the nature of Persian rule in the so-called Upper Satrapies, as there are few archaeological remains that have been discovered. Scholars tend to not be as interested in Achaemenid Central Asia as they have been for Hellenistic Central Asia, so the record is even more sparse. Thankfully, a preserved archive containing administrative documents written on leather skins in Imperial Aramaic has illuminated this dark period, but it appears that by all extents the Persians did not wish to meddle too much in the pre-existing framework of the region. Bactria, also known as Zariaspa, served as the capital of the satrapy, and is also where the Greeks derived their name Bactria. The Greek knowledge of Bactria was limited prior to the 4th century. It was on the edge of the known world, a place where only legendary conquerors like Cyrus the Great of Persia or Semiramis of Assyria dared march. But authors such as Herodotus and Ctesias could draw their information from Persian sources. A curious tale that stemmed later from the Alexandrian tradition speaks of a people living in Sogdiana known as the Branchidae. Evidently, these were the descendants of a clan of Milesian Greeks deported by Xerxes following the Battle of Plataea. They apparently had sided with the Persians and committed sacrilege against a local temple, for which they feared retribution, and begged the great king for help. While the Branchidae would meet a grim fate during the time of Alexander, the practice of deportation to Bactria and Sogdiana was commonly employed by Persia. The Bactrians and various peoples living in the region were viewed as an important element of the empire, and a major source of manpower to be directly looked after by one of the relatives of the great king. The defeat of Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 generally marks the end of the Persian Empire, in the sense that no great assemblies would be called on behalf of the great king to stop the Macedonian army of Alexander the Great. Darius and his remaining followers fled into the upper satrapies to regroup and try to reconsolidate power, but a mutiny saw the great king imprisoned and eventually murdered by a conspiracy among his own ranks, headed by the satrap of Bactria named Bessus. Alexander was not far behind, hoping to take Darius alive, but to no avail. This inaugurated a Bactrian campaign, whereby Alexander would seek to punish the murderers of his predecessor and finally put an end to any resistance from Persian officials or local chieftains. In contrast to the lightning speed of the Macedonian army as they moved from Europe to Egypt and Iraq during the first 4 years of the campaign, the conquest of Bactria and Sogdiana was a long slog of marches and countermarches from early 329 to mid-327. Alexander did not just have to deal with pretenders to the Persian throne. Warlords and military strongmen littered the region, unwilling to bend the knee to the arrival of foreign invaders. There was no single authority to contend with. meaning that each pocket of resistance needed to be systematically rooted out and eliminated. As soon as the Macedonians vacated the premises, another revolt or rebel leader would emerge to take its place. The climate and geography of the region must have compounded the struggles faced by the troops as well. Men froze to death during the winters, and access to drinking water always remained a major problem thanks to the region's aridity. It is unsurprising then that massacres against both enemy troops and civilians alike, including the previously mentioned Bronchidae, became a common terror tactic used by Alexander to try and quell resistance, and as a way for the troops to vent their frustration. While the wholesale enslavement and killing of non-combatants was largely an accepted byproduct of ancient warfare, the number of deaths inflicted upon the local population was quite staggering. Anywhere up to 120,000 Bactrians could have directly lost their lives during the fighting. To ensure that Bactria and Sogdiana remained within his control, Alexander set up several garrisons and military colonies. These were to be filled with thousands of Greek mercenaries and aged veterans from his army. While reality was a far cry from the supposed 70 cities founded by Alexander, Bactria by and large experienced the greatest concentration of Greek colonization out of all the other satrapies under his control. Following his siege of the Sogdian Rock in 327, Alexander married Roxana, reputedly the second most beautiful woman in Asia. Despite the insistence of the ancient authors that it was love at first sight on the king's part, it is important to note that her father was Oxyartes, one of the most important nobles of Bactria. There could have been a genuine romantic connection between the two, but Alexander was also forging a political alliance between himself and the Bactrian and Sogdian elites. Ever the pragmatist, Alexander placed many of these local strongmen and nobles in administrative roles, overseeing his Central Asian and Indian satrapies, including his father-in-law Oxyartes and the later Indian kings Taxiles and Poros. These men understood the political landscape better than any Greek, and could be useful allies, though Alexander made sure to leave Macedonian commanders behind to act as a guarantor of the local leaders' good behavior. For the most part, Alexander was able to head to India without having to worry about a full-scale revolt as he had before. However, Macedonian control over Bactria remained precarious. Ironically, this instability would be from Alexander's own men, rather than through another indigenous uprising. A rumor of the king's death in India prompted a smaller rebellion in 326-325. Word soon reached the Greek settlers in Bactria of Alexander's death in Babylon in June of 323, whereupon they immediately revolted and attempted to march back to the Mediterranean. Diodorus suggests 23,000 men had formed this homesick army, which indicates the extent of colonization within the area that occurred under Alexander. This was dealt with by the commander Python, who initially wanted to cut a deal with the rebels as a way to take control of the region as an independent warlord, but was forced to massacre them wholesale on the orders of the standing regent Perdiccas. As the wars of the successors intensified in the western regions of Alexander's former empire, the upper satrapies, the provinces east of Mesopotamia, which included much of the Iranian plateau and parts of India, gradually gained their independence. Many of the Macedonian commanders left behind were either drawn into the conflict, murdered at the hands of the indigenous population and disaffected colonists, or disappear from the record entirely. Out of all the successors, the reunification of the upper satrapies would be left to Seleucus, the eponymous founder of the Seleucid Empire. Initially a background player of the Wars of the Diadohoi, Seleucus was promoted to the position of satrap of Babylonia, and eventually became one of the main contenders in the conflict. Following his victory over the Antigonids during the Babylonian War in 309, he embarked on a military expedition to reconsolidate the upper satrapies. Little is known about the event, but he seems to have been quite successful. Seleucus even launched an invasion across the Indus River and warred with the Indian emperor Chandragupta Maurya, but eventually the two came to terms in the year 303. Using 500 war elephants gained as part of the treaty with Chandragupta, Seleucus managed to win a spectacular victory against the Antigonids at the Battle of Ipsus in 301. He was now in control of almost the entirety of Alexander's Asian provinces, stretching from Asia Minor to Bactria and Sogdiana. Given the challenge of maintaining such a vast territory, and perhaps to avoid dynastic strife, Seleucus raised his son Antiochus to the status of co-king, and sent him to oversee the upper satrapies in 294. Relegating the junior ruler to the east was not meant to diminish Antiochus, nor the importance of the upper satrapies. Bactria and Sogdiana were not viewed as peripheral outliers, but core territories which provided an economic and military boon to the empire as a whole. Apame, Seleucus' wife and Antiochus' mother, was the daughter of a powerful Sogdian warlord, Spinamenes, who led one of the massive revolts during Alexander's campaign. Sending his half-Sogdian son, who may have been taught the language by his mother, was a smart move if Seleucus was looking to curry goodwill for an area that had given Alexander so much trouble, and had only just been brought under Macedonian control again. Seleucid propaganda was also not above catering to the local Iranian population when needed. The choice of Apollo as the dynasty's patron deity and depiction of the god as a bowman on their coinage could evoke Iranian models of kingship, which stressed the image of the king as a great warrior archer. In terms of military output, the Seleucids could call upon vast numbers of Iranian cavalrymen and troops to serve in their armies. One of the chronicles recorded by the astronomers of Babylon lists 20 elephants being delivered from Bactria for the war effort against Ptolemy II Philadelphus in 274. It was during this time we see Seleucid activity within Central Asia at its most intensive. Antiochus I would build several cities within the region, either creating brand new settlements or refounding and adding to previous outposts of Alexander. Though it was greatly expanded on during the Greco-Bactrian period, Antiochus likely oversaw the foundation of the city of Ai Khanoum, the only Greek settlement in Bactria to have been preserved and extensively excavated. Rather than giving Alexander the credit for the monetization of the economy of the upper satrapies, much of this was tied directly to the policies of Seleucus and Antiochus, who established the main mint of the region in the city of Bactra. Though Bactria and Sogdiana were indeed considered important to the integrity of the Seleucid realm, we also can see how imperial propaganda could change its perception to suit its interests. A Seleucid general named Demodamas had explored the region between the Jaxartes River and the Aral Sea, marking the end of his journey by consecrating altars to Apollo at the banks of the river. Demodamas may have also been responsible for overseeing the refounding of Alexandria Eshkate into Antioch in Scythia, which may have been attacked by the nomads during the period following Alexander's death. These actions may be seen as symbolically demarcating the boundaries between the quote-unquote civilized Greek Seleucid world and that of the wild frontier of the steppes. A precedent could be found with Alexander himself when he established the altars at the banks of the Hyphasis River to mark the end of his journey in India. Following Seleucus' assassination in 281, Antiochus would spend the rest of his career in Syria and the eastern Mediterranean. From the 270s to the 240s, both Antiochus I and his son Antiochus II Theos would dedicate their time and energy to combating their Ptolemaic rivals in Egypt or dealing with affairs in Asia Minor instead. Regardless of a lack of sources, we can safely assume that the direct presence of Seleucid monarchs in Bactria and Sogdiana had gradually declined as attention was focused to the western parts of the empire. This may be attested to by numismatics. Of the surviving Seleucid coins minted in Bactria, 62 specimens have been recovered from the time of Antiochus I, yet only 2 date to Antiochus II. As a consequence of this prolonged absence or lack of attention, a rift had developed between the local officials and the imperial household. Despite being given important roles with a great degree of power, the lack of any direct oversight may well have given the satraps confidence to lord over their assigned territories. They may have paid lip service to the crown on paper, but a time of great turmoil could provide the excuse for these men to make a grab for further power. And a crisis is exactly what happened next. In the year 246, Antiochus II died of unknown circumstances. A subsequent dynastic feud both within and between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic houses resulted in the outbreak of the Third Syrian War, with Ptolemy III Euergetes launching a full-scale invasion against Seleucus II Callinicus that penetrated the Seleucid heartland as far as Mesopotamia. Less than a few years later, a civil war broke out between Seleucus and his younger brother Antiochus Hyrax, further throwing the kingdom into chaos. According to the traditionally accepted narrative, two satraps decided to exploit the anarchy in the western territories and make a bid for independence. The first was Andragoras, an Iranian-born noble who oversaw the region of Parthia. Perhaps he had attempted to leverage a chance at kingship with the support of a disaffected Iranian community. The coins bearing his name are reminiscent of those of other Hellenistic kings, but with features more akin to an Iranian or Persian monarchy. However, a tribe of horse-rearing nomads known as the Parni put an end to his plans. The Parni had originally been members of the Dahai Confederacy, along with other tribes of the steppe, and sometime around the early 3rd century they had broken off and settled along the Caspian Sea. Hostility between them and the Seleucids soon erupted into outright warfare, as they attempted to raid into Margiana in the 280s. But the general Demadamus managed to inflict such a heavy defeat that we hear almost nothing about them for the next 3 decades. Around the time of Andragoras' revolt, Arsaces I was crowned as king of the Parni in the year 248 or 247 at the city of Asak, dated as the foundation year of the Parthian era. A talented and ambitious leader, Arsaces must have realized the tumultuous situation faced by the Seleucid kings, and the opportunity to move into better and more productive lands was too tempting. Exploiting the distraction of the Seleucids, Arsaces launched an attack against Andragoras and killed him, putting an end to the would-be dynast's plans. By 239, the domain of Arsaces would include both Parthia and Hyrcania, the regions along the eastern border of the Caspian Sea. This marked the effective beginning of the Parthian Empire, as the Parni would be known thereafter as the Parthians, which would become one of the great states of the ancient world. According to Justin, in the same period as Andragoras' rebellion and Arsaces' invasion of Parthia, the satrap of Bactria was a man named Diodotus. We don't know much about his background nor his relationship with the Seleucids, but he seems to have been an experienced official in Bactria for several years. Allegedly inspired by Andragoras and the weakness of the Seleucids, Diodotus would declare himself king. Coins were struck in his name bearing the expression, "of the king Diodotus," in Greek, and his profile was adorned with a royal diadem. Abandoning the Seleucid image of a seated Apollo, he chose the iconography of Zeus standing astride wielding a thunderbolt. It was appropriate. The name Diodotus translates to God-given or Zeus-given. The growing power of the Parthians directly threatened Bactria, and Diodotus led an army against Arsaces to prevent the nomads from invading. He managed to drive the Parthians out of the area, his military victory inaugurating his reign as the first king of what can now be called the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, earning him the epithet Soter, or Savior. Diodotus I died shortly after these events, and the next king of Bactria would be his son, Diodotus II. The younger Diodotus was more willing to come to terms with the Parthians than his father, and struck a peace agreement between himself and Arsaces as a part of a mutual understanding of each other's claims. All of the events that transpired in Bactria and Parthia were not lost upon Seleucus II. After securing a peace treaty with Ptolemy III and entering into a state of uneasy coexistence with Antiochus Hyrax, Seleucus launched an expedition into the upper satrapies to restore his authority. Perhaps by 236 or 235, the Seleucid army invaded Parthia and clashed with Arsaces, sending the Parthian king fleeing into the steppes. In a second battle, Arsaces managed to defeat Seleucus, forcing the Seleucid king to abandon Parthia altogether or recognize Arsaces as a client king. Diodotus notably did not participate in the fighting, either honoring the terms of his treaty with Arsaces or hoping to use the Parthians as a shield against Seleucid retaliation. This reasonably coherent chain of events has generally been accepted as the beginning of Greco-Bactria as an independent state. Unfortunately, reality is not so kind. At best, this is a loose reconstruction and reconciliation of very messy sources. As I have relayed to you, the traditional narrative generally agrees upon the year 246-245 as the turning point for Seleucid Central Asia to the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. It coincides nicely with the outbreak of the Third Syrian War, correlating with the gradual weakening of Seleucid power in the upper satrapies, which is claimed by authors like Justin and Strabo. These same writers also saw the rise of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom and the Parthian Empire as inseparable events, as both were deeply involved in the affairs of the other. There are, of course, contradictions in our sources. The name Parthian has given rise to confusion since it could refer to either the residents of the satrapy or the name of the nomadic Parni who later settled there. Some neglect to mention Diodotus, and others confuse him for later kings. The exact order of events has been heavily debated as well, and a dizzying number of sequences have been put forward. Never mind that, the chronology and dating of these events is also a very divisive subject. Scholars can be roughly grouped into two camps: high and low chronologists. Low chronologists accept the orthodox dating of 246-245, with the revolts occurring in the reign of Seleucus II, while the high chronologists believe that the events took place during the time of his father, Antiochus II, over 10 years earlier. Though he provides the most complete account of the events in Bactria and Parthia, Justin confuses the situation by suggesting that the rebellions of Diodotus and Androgoras occurred in the reign of Seleucus II, but curiously dates it to the consulship of Manlius Vulso and Attilius Regulus, the Roman commanders of the First Punic War in 256-255. The beginning of the Parthian era in 248-247 does make Arsaces' coronation fit rather neatly into the commonly accepted framework, but this could have been retroactively dated by a later Parthian ruler. In addition to the difficulties in trying to reconcile a time for these events, there are some who challenge the traditional narrative of Bactria's separation from the Seleucid Empire and argue that the Diodotid kings were not independent dynasts, but instead some sort of vassal rulers or subordinate officials. The sheer size of the Seleucid realm made administration a daunting task, and the kings were functionally always on the move to try and cope with the issue, but they were mostly preoccupied with events in the eastern Mediterranean, namely the semi-regular bouts of warfare with Ptolemies over the sovereignty of Syria. Joint kingship was one possible answer, as Antiochus I started off his career overseeing the eastern provinces, while the more experienced Seleucus I focused on the western part of the empire. Yet this could also lead to civil war, as what happened with Antiochus Hyrax when he was given authority over Asia Minor. A potential solution could be found through the granting of privileges to local power holders, who could safeguard Seleucid interests in return for the right to mint their own coins or to use the title of king. Such a proposition was not uncommon for Seleucid policy. Arsaces himself was likely made into a vassal king, as his coins only bear the title autocrator, which carries much less weight than something like Basileus. A similar arrangement may have taken place with the Attalid dynasty that oversaw Pergamon. Empires both before and afterwards would employ client kingdoms to oversee the security of their borders, so an arrangement of this nature is not out of the realm of possibility. Evidence for this lies in the dynamics of the relationships of the Seleucids and the Diodotids. Though Diodotus the Elder was said to have taken the title of king, most of the coins bearing his portrait were minted during the time of Diodotus II. The younger Diodotus also never fought against Seleucus II when the latter launched a retaliatory campaign against Arsaces, despite technically being allies with the Parthians. If Seleucus came to terms with Arsaces, there's no reason to think that he wouldn't have reached out to the Bactrians as well. It's also very possible that Diodotus pressured Seleucus into giving him the rights of kingship and coinage due to the violent struggles with the Parthians, which would also explain the coin specimens celebrating the elder Diodotus' victory over the nomads. Additionally, if Bactria, a very wealthy and important province of the Seleucid realm, truly rebelled and was sundered from their grasp, it is unlikely that the Seleucids would have just accepted the loss without making a fight for it. There are also a couple pieces of information from the Ptolemaic point of view that may lend support for this line of reasoning. An inscription issued by Ptolemy III in the town of Adulis in the modern East African country of Eritrea greatly exaggerated the king's conquests during the Third Syrian War, claiming that he took Seleucid territory up to and including Bactria. While obviously untrue, the Egyptian army only reached Babylon, it does suggest that the region was still considered a part of the Seleucid Empire by the time of the war. A collection of ancient stratagems also states that Ptolemy was able to convince all the satraps as far as India to defect to the Ptolemaic side, further supporting the idea of a loyal Bactria. Whether conditionally or autonomously, the Diadotids now ruled Bactria and Sogdiana on their own accord. Traditionally, the Diadotid dynasty is thought to have only lasted for 2 kings, with Diodotus II ruling from roughly 239 down to approximately 226. This is a fairly long period, though it is quite possible that there was a period of joint kingship between father and son, following the Seleucid practice. An argument has been put forward that there is a missing third king of the Diadotid line, based entirely on numismatic evidence. There are coin specimens that display the imagery of a typical Diadotid coin, with the thundering Zeus on the reverse and a portrait of Diodotus I on the front. Rather than bearing the name of either the elder or the younger Diodotus, it instead reads, "of the king Antiochus Nicator." Some have used this evidence to support the notion that Diodotus I was a loyal satrap of Antiochus II, a transitory period before Diodotus II started minting coins with their own image and name. But analysis suggests that at least some of these coins were minted long after the elder Diodotus' death, and there are commemorative types minted by the later Indo-Greek ruler Agathocles, referring to an Antiochus Nicator as well. Additionally, Antiochus II was known by the epithet Theos, not Nicator, and the choice to mix Seleucid and Diadotid imagery has very little precedent among the other Hellenistic monarchies. Whether it was 2 Diodotids or 3, Bactria once again goes silent in our sources for the next 2 decades. No Seleucid ruler visited the region during this time, and so we have little to go upon for literary accounts. In terms of numismatics, Diodotus the Younger appears to have initiated a wave of coin striking and monetization. He ordered the establishment of a second mint, and in contrast to the silver and gold issues of previous rulers and satraps, he also struck a series of bronze coins and smaller silver denominations, enabling everyday Bactrians to get a hold of coin money outside of a privileged elite. Why this policy was enacted is a curious question. Perhaps it was necessary to fund some sort of building project and the payment of laborers, though there are no cities in the record that bear the name of Diodotus. It may have been necessary to pay for troops and mercenaries. Smaller denominations would have been useful in this manner, especially if the Seleucids had given Diodotus II a pass to conduct his affairs with a degree of autonomy. By the 220s, though, the political situation of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom was shaken up once again, as a man named Euthydemus appears in the record. A descendant of Ionian Greek settlers from the city of Magnesia, we aren't exactly sure of his position within Bactria, though it is quite likely he was a government official or even a Diadotid general given his later career. Shortly before 225, Euthydemus overthrew the last reigning Diadotid, establishing himself as the king and founder of the Euthydemid dynasty. The coinage reflects this change as well. Instead of Zeus holding the thunderbolt, the Euthydemids chose to present the club-wielding demigod Heracles as their dynastic emblem. The next 2 decades saw Euthydemus establish his rule over Bactria, perhaps fighting with the Diodotids or other potential rivals challenging his usurpation. His son Demetrius, apparently a man who cut an impressive and charismatic figure, was probably made into a junior ruler to help oversee operations. A change of regime would certainly have gotten the attention of any opportunistic rulers, which is precisely what happened. For the first time in over 30 years, a Seleucid king had made an appearance in the upper satrapies. Antiochus III, the youngest son of Seleucus II, was on the move towards Bactria. He was in the middle of his anabasis, a great eastern expedition intended to restore Seleucid control in the Iranian plateau and Central Asia after the disastrous near collapse of the dynasty in 223. A talented commander, Antiochus forced the submission of the Parthian king Arsaces II, and in 209 he had cast his eyes on the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. From what fragments we can glean from Polybius, it appears that Euthydemus attempted to stop the Seleucid king's progress by meeting him at the region of Aria, mustering an army that included, or was entirely composed of, 10,000 cavalrymen. Even if we conservatively accept half that number, It reveals the extensive military capabilities of the Greco-Bactrians, many of whom were probably Iranian horsemen native to the region. This cavalry was sent ahead to the Aria River, the modern Hari, to act as scouts and guards, while Euthydemus himself was encamped further away. Antiochus's speedy arrival had surprised the now panicked Bactrians, who preemptively launched an attack to try and overwhelm the smaller force. Joined by his personal agema of 2,000 cavalry and another 1,000 light infantry, Antiochus managed to best the Bactrian horsemen at the cost of a few teeth from an injury to his mouth during the engagement. Following the disaster at the Battle of the Aria River, Euthydemus withdrew his forces to Bactra, where he intended to fortify his position. Thus began a brutal 2-year siege, lasting from 208 to 206. We are missing Polybius's account of the siege of Bactra, but the implication that Euthydemus was able to resist the efforts of one of the most powerful military forces for over 2 years reveals the extent of Bactra's fortifications and the ample foodstuffs of the Bactrians. Antiochus probably sent his forces across the countryside to scour for supplies and deal with resistance, but to suggest anything beyond that would be purely hypothetical, and we have little information about the interim. In 206, a Seleucid delegate named Teleus met with Euthydemus to discuss terms. The Greco-Bactrian king defended his actions, claiming that he had not revolted against Antiochus's forebears, but had destroyed those who did, referring to the Diadotids. Euthydemus also advised Teleus that allowing him to keep his position was in the best interest of the Seleucids. He alone was defending against the potential expansion of the steppe nomads like the Parthians or the Saka, a major threat to the security of both their respective kingdoms. Some have interpreted this warning as an attempt by Euthydemus to blackmail Antiochus, hinting that he could call the nomads his allies. As we recall, Diadotus II managed to make some sort of treaty or arrangement with Arsaces I, but Euthydemus appears to have been earnest in his reasoning, even though it was almost entirely out of self-interest. Antiochus agreed with the sentiment, and after spending a long time in the upper satrapies, he could not delay his return to Syria, lest he be bogged down in logistical issues or see a potential rebellion erupt back home. During the final negotiations, Euthydemus sent Demetrius in his place to ratify the treaty. The Seleucid king was apparently impressed by the regal bearing and manners of the young man, and offered to marry one of his daughters to secure the alliance. Euthydemus and Demetrius were thus allowed to retain their titles, but in return were required to hand over large quantities of grain, along with Euthydemus's remaining war elephants. Whether Antiochus actually provided the Seleucid princess is unclear, though it has not stopped scholars from endlessly speculating on the dynastic workings of the Euthydemid house. Antiochus soon departed south across the Hindu Kush, and while on paper Greco-Bactria was a subordinate kingdom, he would be the last Seleucid ruler to ever journey this far east into these lands. An inscription, discovered near the city of Kuliab in Tajikistan and making its first appearance on the antiquities market in 2004, gives a bit of insight into the reigns of Euthydemus and Demetrius I. It was a dedication to the goddess Hestia by a man named Heliodotos, honoring both father and son. Quote, "This fragrant altar to you, august Hestia, most honored among the gods, Heliodotos established in the grove of Zeus with its fair trees, furnishing it with libations and burnt offerings, so that you may graciously preserve, free from care, together with divine good fortune, Euthydemus, greatest of all kings, and his outstanding son Demetrios, renowned for fine victories." End quote. The date of this text is thought to be between 200 and 195 BC, and there are a few interesting elements to note. Being so close to the campaigns of Antiochus III, the description of Euthydemus as Basileus Megistos, greatest of all kings, potentially reads as a poke at Antiochus's adoption of the title Basileus Megas, great king. No doubt that Euthydemus was keen to twist his agreement into a propaganda piece, celebrating a great victory over the Seleucid king. Yet, there are Euthydemid coins dating to 206 that have an anchor next to the monogram, a quintessentially Seleucid symbol that reflects the subordinate relationship of Bactria to Antiochus. It is following the reigns of Euthydemus and Demetrius I that our term narrative begins to lose all meaning. For many of the rulers after these two, minus few exceptions, we only know of their existence through coinage. A scarcity of evidence has resulted in wildly divergent interpretations as to the chronology of the region. From what we are told, Demetrius embarked on a series of successful campaigns into India. The Kuliev inscription may have also been written shortly after the start of Demetrius's invasions, as it gives Demetrius the epithet Kallinicus, beautiful victory. A later source also describes an Arachosian city bearing the name Demetrius, presumably founded by Demetrius following the crossing of the Hindu Kush, and coins struck in his image show him wearing an elephant skin cap to symbolize his eastern conquests. We will leave the details of this campaign and the rest of the Indo-Greek kings for later, but it is important to understand that Demetrius and his successors were able to establish themselves as India in the wake of his conquests, and there are multiple Euthydemid kings ruling at the same time in both Bactria and India throughout the early 2nd century. However, there are hints of larger political changes that occurred during Euthydemid rule in Central Asia. Based upon archaeological evidence, or perhaps rather a lack thereof, it is argued that Sogdiana had been able to successfully regain its independence during the mid to late 3rd century. Few Hellenistic remains are found dating between the end of the Seleucid period to the time of the later Greco-Bactrian kings in the mid-2nd century, leading some to suggest that it fell out of Greek control during the transition from Diadochid to Euthydemid rule in the 220s, or during the siege of Bactra. It is quite possible that this was the nomadic threat that Euthydemus was referring to during his negotiations with Antiochus, as the Sogdians and nomads would have preyed upon Bactria and the exhausted Seleucid army if perceived as weak enough. Shortly following the campaigns of Demetrius, we find the name of Euthydemus II appearing in the numismatic record. He was possibly Demetrius's brother, and took control of Bactria by the early 180s, presumably after Euthydemus I had died. Along with Euthydemus II, we find two other kings in India named Agathocles and Pantaleon. It is argued that they were contemporaries, because they all minted copper-nickel coins, a copper-nickel alloy which up to that point was exclusively used by the Chinese. Few coins of Pantaleon have ever been found, suggesting that this king had ruled for only a short time. After Pantaleon, we find King Antimachus I, as evidenced by a tax receipt dating to the early to mid-2nd century that begins with the expression, during the reign of Antimachus Theos and Eumenes and Antimachus. The use of Theos, the god or the divine, makes Antimachus the first Greco-Bactrian ruler to explicitly adopt an epithet while they were alive, and may hint at the establishment of a royal cult. While the first name is obviously referring to Antimachus I Theos, the mysterious nature of Eumenes and this second Antimachus leaves much to the imagination. Perhaps these were other Greco-Bactrian kings that had not appeared in the numismatic record, or maybe his children raised to the status of junior rulers. The coinage of Antimachus is also quite unusual. His coin series shows him wearing the kausia, the broad-brim hat so associated with Macedonian settlers and soldiers, which is quite unique in the context of Hellenistic kingship. He also bears the distinction of being one of, if not the only Hellenistic rulers whose portrait shows himself smiling. There is too much danger in making assumptions of the personalities of kings based solely on their physical appearance on coins, but the choice of presentation is fascinating. Yet these coins and documents tell us little about what was happening in the area, and once again we are left largely in the dark. After another 25 years of silence, we get our last major Greco-Bactrian king in the sources, Eucratides I. He was not of the Euthydemid family, and no further information about his origins can be confirmed, though Tarn believed that he was related to the Seleucids. Justin claims that Eucratides came to power around the same time as King Mithridates I of Parthia, which has been dated to roughly around 170 BC. In that period, Eucratides led a civil war in Bactria, possibly against Antimachus I and or the junior figures Eumenes and Antimachus II, and soon followed up with the conquest of Sogdiana. By most accounts, his rule saw the Greco-Bactrian kingdom at its height, and was deeply admired by later authors. Justin describes him as a great king, matched by his adoption of the title the Great, and is the famous ruler of 1,000 cities of Strabo. Eucratides is said to have founded a major city in Bactria, appropriately named Eucratidea, which has been suggested to be the site of Ai Khanoum. The largest gold coin ever minted, the Eucratidion, was struck during his rule. Word of Eucratides' successes extended beyond Bactria, and inspired others to emulate him. The Seleucid usurper Timarchus of Miletus minted coins while ruling in Media that were direct copies of the Eucratidion. One coin type, often dated to the reign of Eucratides, carries the portrait of Eucratides wielding a javelin on the front, and on the reverse are the profiles of a man and woman named Heliocles and Laodice respectively. A double profile on a coin face has been seen in other near-contemporary examples, notably coin types of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II of Egypt, and it stands to the reason that both Heliocles and Laodice were likely married. It is a curious specimen, primarily because Heliocles does not wear a diadem, the symbol of royal office, but Laodice does. To some, Laodice is viewed as a Seleucid princess, given the proliferation of that name in the dynasty, and thus is the mother of Eucratides, explaining the reasoning that he was a Seleucid agent. Heliocles' origin is more obscure, though he probably was a high-ranking individual in the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. These specimens could therefore be commemorative issues of Eucratides honoring his parents. However, recent arguments suggest that Heliocles and Laodice were not necessarily the parents of Eucratides, but instead figures that were contemporary or ruled shortly after Eucratides that were evoking his image and name. Laodice may have even been Eucratides' wife. Since these two are not attested to in our sources, reconstruction is nearly impossible. At some point during his career, Eucratides launched an invasion into Arachosia and the Punjab. This led him to clash with an Indo-Greek king named Demetrius, presumably a Euthydemed ruler in Arachosia who descended from Demetrius I. Demetrius II proved to be a formidable opponent, and with an army of 60,000 men he drove back Eucratides into a citadel or fortified settlement, whereupon he placed the usurper king under siege. Despite having only 300 soldiers, they put up a spirited defense and held out for 5 months before managing to break out of the city. A seemingly fantastical story, though the only one we have. Following a rendezvous, Eucratides was able to overcome Demetrius in battle, and united parts of India under his rule. But peace was not meant to last, for upon his return to Bactria, Eucratides was murdered by his own son, his body cast aside and left unburied in roughly the year 145. So ended the golden age of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, and the successors of Eucratides would see the realm torn apart by further fractious infighting and outside invasions within a few short decades. Before we conclude the final years of Hellenistic Bactria, let's pause our narrative for now. In the next part, we will look closer at the organization and layout of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, looking at the evidence to see how the landscape was reshaped by the arrival of thousands of Greek settlers, and the response from the local Bactrians and Sogdians alike. Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 75, Greco-Bactria, Alexandria Eshkate to Ai Khanoum. The concept of a flourishing Greek civilization in Central Asia has served as a source of wonder for many, compounded by a lack of literary and archaeological evidence. Since the 1960s, a wealth of information has come forward that, while still quite small and situated in an unstable political environment, has nevertheless revealed a great deal about the organization and landscape of Hellenistic Bactria. But as much as these discoveries support a strong Hellenic presence, they also demonstrate that the Greco-Bactrian and successor Indo-Greek kingdoms are no less complex than the other Hellenistic states. With our narrative adjourned at the death of Eucratides, let us look towards the social, economic, political, and cultural organization of Greco-Bactria to better understand what life was like for both Greeks and Bactrians during the Hellenistic period. One of the most captivating monikers used by ancient authors to describe Bactria is Land of 1,000 Cities. Paradoxically, the amount of archaeological evidence for urban settlements dating to the Hellenistic period is remarkably thin. Our sources indicate that building and colonization projects began shortly after Alexander's arrival. Strabo suggests that he founded 8 cities in Bactria and Sogdiana, whereas Plutarch claims upwards of 70 throughout all of Asia. Later kings like Seleucus I, Antiochus I, and Eucratides I are said to have established new settlements in the region. Regardless of the number of cities that were actually founded, we can determine that the extent of colonization and settlement was extraordinary. More colonists were placed in Bactria and Sogdiana by Alexander than all the other Asian satrapies combined. He had faced an incredible amount of resistance from the local communities during his conquest, so it is only natural to assume that the populating of cities and military outposts with Greeks and Macedonians was to act as a bulwark against a native uprising. However, most of the colonists were soldiers unable to serve due to infirmity or old age, so it was also a way to relieve the burden of Alexander's army. It is also worth noting that Alexander tended to send Greek mercenaries, some of whom he felt were disloyal or untrustworthy, to the most remote satrapies. Deportation to Bactria was a policy practiced by Persian rulers as well, so Alexander was following a precedent and likely looking to keep his more seditious troops out of the way. The resentment of the colonists being forcibly settled so far away from their homeland quickly made itself apparent, as they revolted in 326-325, and more famously in 323 after Alexander's death. Diodorus says over 23,000 men made up the army of the second revolt, who were all cut down to a man on the orders of the standing regent Perdiccas. It is therefore prudent that a survey of the major urban settlements of Bactria and Sogdiana are in order. At the most distant tendrils of Alexander's empire and the Greco-Bactrian world was the city of Alexandria Eshkate, appropriately translated as Alexandria the Farthest. As the name implies, it was the northernmost colony ever established by Alexander and his successors, and most scholars tend to locate it at the site of modern Khojan, Tajikistan, previously Lennabad. Built along the Sir Daria and the opening to the Fergana Valley, the city was intended to be a buffer against the nomads of the steppes. It's quite possible that it was built atop the remains of Syropolis, founded by the Persian king Cyrus the Great during his own expedition into Scythia, further cementing its military purpose. This settlement threatened to cut off the close economic relationship between the local Sogdians and the nomads, inspiring a satrapy-wide rebellion. At some point after Alexander's departure, the city may have been attacked and destroyed by one of the local steppe tribes out of retaliation. In the 290s, a Seleucid general named Demodamas of Miletus was commissioned to explore and oversee the area between the Sir Daria and the Aral Sea, and he probably oversaw the refoundation of Alexandria Eshkate into Antioch in Scythia, named after his benefactor Antiochus I. Antioch in Margiana, the later site of Merv in modern Turkmenistan, was founded by the eponymous Antiochus I. The Greeks were not the first to recognize its importance. Thanks to the runoff of mountain rivers, Merv was situated in an oasis at the mouth of the hostile Karakum Desert, and apparently a suitable place to plant the grapevine. It is unsurprising then that the area saw many settlements dated to both before and after the Hellenistic period, as its strategic and geographic value was well understood. The region was dotted heavily with military fortresses during Greek rule, and Antiochus himself ordered the construction of large stone fortifications. Excavations have revealed that the defensive walls measured 10 meters in height and over 8 kilometers in length, making it overwhelmingly the largest city in Margiana. His extensive militarization of the area may have been inspired by the possible destruction of settlements that were previously placed there by Alexander. As the caravan routes of Central Asia developed under later Parthian rule, so too did Merv's importance as a watering hole and trading hub. Interestingly, the city itself would see the arrival of another displaced population from the Mediterranean, 10,000 Roman legionaries, captured at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, after Marcus Licinius Crassus led them in a failed campaign against the Parthian Empire. Following their imprisonment, the legionaries were transported to Merv and reportedly ordered to build up the city's fortifications. One of the major cities of Bactria was Bactra, located in northern Afghanistan at the modern site of Balkh. Also known as Zaryaspa, it was the administrative capital during the rule of the Persians, and it continued to function much the same way during the Greco-Bactrian period. It probably held the primary mint in the region, originally established by the Seleucids, and continued to strike coins into the last rulers of Greco-Bactria. Its defenses must have been extensive, as King Euthydemus was able to endure a vicious siege by Antiochus III from 208 to 206. Centuries of development by later Central Asian powers, particularly the Kushan Empire, have largely removed the major monuments dating to the Hellenistic period, and extensive portions remain buried under debris generated over 2 millennia of continuous human habitation. In southern Tajikistan on the banks of the Amu Darya is Tak-i-Sangin, Throne of Stone in the Tajik language. Its unassuming position and lack of appearance in the sources is betrayed by the remarkable discoveries uncovered by archaeological missions. It is home to an enormous temple which received substantial donations and deposits over the centuries, likely paying tribute to the deified Oxus River. It may even be the origin of the famous Oxus treasure, a collection of beautiful gold jewelry and other artifacts dating between the Persian and the Kushan period. While such a provenance is almost impossible to identify now, there are many artifacts that have been recovered from the site, such as painted terracotta busts and various other objects deposited in the temples as votives. Yet, without a doubt, the most important city ever uncovered in the archaeological record of Greco-Bactria, and for the entirety of the Hellenistic Far East in general, is Ai Khanoum. Discovered during a hunting trip of the Afghan king Muhammad Zahir Shah in 1961, the ruins of Ai Khanoum can be found in the Takhar province of northeastern Afghanistan, at the confluence of the Kokcha River and the Amu Darya. For the first time, scholars had something to work with, a way to dispel the Bactrian mirage, an idea that was rooted in the failed attempts of the first archaeologists to locate any indication of a prosperous Greek civilization, as hinted by Justin and Strabo. Of course, as excavations continued throughout the 1960s and 70s, it soon became apparent that this Greek city clearly possessed a more multifaceted or cosmopolitan identity than originally believed. As much as it illuminates our understanding of the period, several aspects continue to elude us. We aren't even sure of the city's true Greek name. Ai Khanoum means Lady Moon in the Uzbek language, and there have been various theories as to its origins. For instance, when we look at the city's structure and organization, it does not appear to have been built all at once, and clearly there are multiple stages of growth and development that make any identification tricky. From what we can tell, it was initially established during the reign of Antiochus I, between 281 and 261 BC, perhaps expanding on an initial Achaemenid structure. Some suggest that its true name is Eucratidaea, built or expanded by Eucratides during the early 2nd century to become his new capital. Other possible names include Alexandria Oxiana, due to the descriptions of ancient geographers who say Alexander founded the city along the Oxus. The so-called Founder's Shrine indicates that the settlement's original leader may have been a man called Kineas, complicating the matter further. In spite of the issues of identification, there are many topographical features of the plains of Ai Khanoum that make it an attractive place to settle. Given its position at the junction of 2 mighty rivers, it had plenty of access to fresh water. The local Bactrians had skillfully built 2 canals designed to bring the water up the plains, but the Greeks later added a 3rd canal, presumably to accommodate for the swollen and densely concentrated population. This river junction also was a major crossing point, enabling the officials to oversee and manage the traffic that would be moving in and out of the region. Engineers and architects took advantage of the elevated position and built well-fortified walls to act as a bulwark against any attacks, though perhaps not as impenetrable as the founders may have hoped. The organizational layout of Ai Khanoum is as follows. Arranged in a triangular formation, the city was laid out on a Hippodamian grid, with its streets meeting at 90-degree angles, a noticeably Greek feature that can still be seen peeking out of the soil in aerial photographs. The cityscape itself is divided into upper and lower portions, with the lower levels containing the bulk of the public structures and is also the most excavated of the pair. Such buildings include a theater, baths, and a gymnasium, all hallmarks of a Greek occupation. Nearby is a large palatial complex, equally indicative of the site's status as a royal capital during at least some part of its lifetime, and a raised acropolis of some 60 meters, 197 feet, further adds to the spectacle. Residencies could be found throughout the city. The southern portion held several large mansions that presumably would house the elite, whereas the simpler homes for commoners could be found in neighborhoods along the Acropolis and other parts of the settlement. Ai Khanoum was truly enormous, with its main street measuring almost 2 kilometers in length, and the total plan covering nearly 300 square kilometers, 115 square miles, or just under 74,000 acres. Despite the preponderance of Greek institutions like the gymnasium, a hippodamian grid, and the theater, there are several elements of Ai Khanoum that bear local influences or demonstrate some unique blend of styles or tastes. The domestic architecture of homes throughout the city, both for rich and poor alike, adheres to the customs of the Bactrians. The settlers of Ai Khanoum could not ignore the realities of the climate of Central Asia when compared to the warmer shores of the Mediterranean, including their access to construction materials. Rather than marble or stone, buildings and fortifications were built with local mud brick and wood techniques. Fireplaces are a common fixture, a necessary feature to deal with the cold and dry Afghan winters. With the Palace of Ai Khanoum, we find a blend of Greek and Iranian designs in both its structure and decoration. The plan was based more on Achaemenid precedents than anything that could be found in Pella or Antioch, with a courtyard and long rectangular hallways containing many private rooms, though it is not necessarily a one-to-one match. Corinthian-style columns and Greek motifs decorated the building's walkways and porticos, though the decomposition of organic materials, furniture, textiles, etc., prevents us from gaining a richer appreciation for the aesthetics of the building. This distinctively Hellenistic mixture was adapted by contemporary and later powers that dominated the region, such as the Parthian city of Nisa and the settlements of the Kushans. What sort of conclusions can we draw upon the impact of Greek rule on the cities of Bactria? In general, the population density of regions like Margiana and Bactria increased with the arrival of the Greeks. We also see the broad importation of Mediterranean architectural and artistic tastes, which also indicates the existence of typically Hellenic institutions and practices. This needs to be tempered with the fact that even our most important example of a Greek city nevertheless betrays a significant Central Asian and even Mesopotamian influence on its appearance and identity. How much we stress the Greek element in certain artistic designs, their incorporation into the urbanized environment of Bactria, and what this means in terms of the culture and attitude of those who lived among them varies wildly. As scholar Rachel Mayers notes, quote, "When is a Corinthian column in the Hellenistic Far East a sign of Greek identity, and when is it something that simply supports a roof?" To be known as the land of 1,000 cities, Bactria must have been prosperous to some extent, something which is very much apparent from both the literary and archaeological record. True, the aridity and temperature fluctuations of many parts of Central Asia could cause severe problems for those trying to make a living off the land. Like with the Nile River in Egypt, the tributary system of the Oxus River enabled for the development of large-scale agriculture, mainly due to the extensive hydraulic knowledge cultivated by the Bactrians over many centuries. It is worthy to note that even after 2 years of siege and plundering of the countryside, Euthydemus was able to supply ample amounts of grain to the army of Antiochus, indicating just how much foodstuffs was being produced. Strabo states that everything but olive trees flourished in Bactria, which included grain and the grapevine. No doubt that local favorites like melons were grown in great quantities as well, the same fruit that reportedly caused Babur, the great Mughal conqueror of India, to burst into tears because they reminded him of his homeland near Samarkand. In addition to subsistence farming, pastoralism was commonly practiced throughout much of the region. Hardy animals like the Karakul sheep provided wool to be used for clothing and textiles, in addition to food products like milk and meat. In the grasslands of Fergana, horses were bred in great numbers and provided some of the finest mounts in the ancient world, the so-called heavenly horses. One of the most important domesticated animals of the region is the Bactrian camel, the two-humped cousin of the one-humped Arabian variety. Their ability to resist the fierce winters and survive months without water made them hardy creatures, but they are also capable of carrying enormous weights for great distances. The abundance of Bactria and Sogdiana is reflected by its sizable population, which has been estimated to be upwards of 2 million people during the Seleucid period. This is smaller than regions like Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, but these lands were still recognized in antiquity as major population centers. In addition to its agricultural productivity, Bactria also held great mineral wealth. The Badakhshan Mountains of Afghanistan remains one of the only sources of lapis lazuli in the world, a rich blue pigment used in both jewelry and cosmetics, and it was a major export for the wider economy of Eurasia since at least the early Bronze Age. 75 kilograms of bulk lapis lazuli was discovered in the ruined treasury of Ai Khanoum, still waiting to be cut and processed in time of need. These mountains are also one of the few tin deposits in Eurasia, providing one of the necessary components to produce bronze. Silver and gold mines must have been present, or at least reasonably accessible by trade, to facilitate the minting of its famous coins. Because of its geographic position and abundant resources, Bactria and Sogdiana would become a major crossroads for the merchants and caravans traveling throughout Eurasia. While overland trade with China would not really kick off until after the end of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, travelers from India and Mesopotamia would journey to and from these lands in great numbers, bringing further wealth and traffic. The presence of Bactrian camels had an important role in facilitating these trade networks and maintaining the logistics of the Bactrians, especially when they made crossing between the oases dotting up and down Central Asia with heavy loads that much easier. The political organization of Bactria is largely unknown, but the few pieces of evidence we have suggest that it was very similar to the practices of other Hellenistic kingdoms, leading one expert to comment that the tax receipts from Bactria are nearly identical to the ones written in Ptolemaic Egypt. The discovery of an archive of administrative documents has given much insight to the early part of Greek rule, where it appears that Alexander did not interfere too much in the structure and organization of the region. How much can this be applied to the later parts of Greco-Bactrian rule is uncertain, but it is unlikely that they made any substantial changes. We know that they divided the regions into smaller satrapies or hyparchies, since Strabo mentions the name of 2 administrative sub-satrapies in western Bactria. Greek remained the dominant language of the administrative class, and its alphabet later became the basis for the earliest forms of a written Bactrian language. We do know that Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Iranian plateau, continued to be used thanks to the recovered archives and the inscriptions of the Indian Emperor Ashoka. It also stands to reason that, like with Egypt, officials drawn from the local Bactrian communities would continue to be employed in the government, though perhaps in the lower levels, while the Greeks continued to form the upper stratum of the elite. This is attested to by the names of officials on administrative documents, who were always the subordinates of higher-ranking administrators with Greek names. In terms of positions, there were probably overseers of the irrigation canals and hydraulic systems, and in the more Hellenic cities you could find officials like the agoranomos, and higher officials like the hyparchs and satraps in royal capitals like Ai Khanoum. Another important responsibility of administration is that of overseeing the minting of coins, invaluable for their ability to inform us about the organization of Hellenistic Central Asia and India. I have stressed caution on the interpretation of coins when looking to reconstruct a history of Bactria, for while they do provide valuable information such as the names of rulers and a possible chronology, the temptation for researchers to create family trees and personalities solely based on their portraits or alleged evidence of lineage remains powerful. When we look past the names of rulers and try to focus on other aspects of coinage, we can glean a surprising amount of information about both the broader picture and finer details. Traditionally, it is thought that Alexander had been the one to liberate much of the silver bullion that was stored in the treasuries of the Persians, monetizing the economy of the East. Most would now give that credit to the Seleucids, who established a mint at Bactra, and the later Greco-Bactrian kings who likely added another mint in Ai Khanoum. The largest coin hoards of the ancient world have been found in Bactria, and there are a great number of them as well. It is important to realize, though, that the number and size of coin hoards do not necessarily indicate the level of monetization in the region, but rather the level of political instability. These deposits were buried but never recovered by their owners, who were either killed or unable to return to the spot because of invasion or any wars fought in the area. One curious feature of Bactrian coinage is the presence of cupronickel, a copper-nickel alloy that gives a distinctive shine, and it can be found in the coins of 3 kings, Euthydemus II, Agathocles, and Pantaleon. The instructions on how to make cupronickel was known to ancient China, but was unheard of in Europe and West Asia until the mid-18th century. How the Bactrians got a hold of it is unknown. Since it was only this series of rulers that struck coins using cupro-nickel, they probably did not gain the knowledge on how to make the alloy from the Chinese, but either received cupro-nickel ingots through the trade, or the plunder taken from the conquests of Demetrius in India, which immediately preceded the reign of Euthydemus II. Overseeing all would be the kings, who presumably followed the model practiced by the Seleucids and Ptolemies, leading the command of armies, hearing petitions, and maintaining a council of close advisors. The Greco-Bactrian rulers frequently implemented joint kingship to mitigate geographical restrictions, a practice that was shared with, or inspired by, the Seleucids. As king, Demetrius was probably able to embark on his conquest of India while his father Euthydemus was still alive, based on evidence from the Kuliabe inscription. Antimachus is said to have reigned alongside junior figures Eumenes and a second Antimachus. Based on some scattered references and evidence, it is likely that some sort of ruler cult was also established. The later ruler Agathocles minted commemorative coins that honored several Greco-Bactrian kings, going back to even Alexander the Great. One of these coins depicts Euthydemus I and gives him the epithet Theos, godlike. A tax document written in the lifetime of Antimachus I describes him also as Theos, indicating that the moniker was no longer restricted to the deceased. Returning to coinage, those minted by the Diodotids were not unusual in their form and presentation, and they still adhered to the template of the king wearing the diadem with an uncovered head. As the later rulers come about, this begins to change. While Hellenistic monarchs and later Roman emperors were prone to unrealistically portraying themselves as eternally youthful throughout their reigns, Euthydemus issued multiple coins that clearly showed the aging process, with the portrait of a dashing young man giving way to wrinkles and plumper features. Antimachus's profile is also distinct because his portrait shows him smiling, an element that is more reminiscent of archaic and classical Greek art from the 5th century than anything from the Hellenistic period. Profiles of Eucratides are more militaristic, and depict him wearing a Boeotian cavalry helmet or wielding a javelin. Antimachus I wears the Kausia, the broad-brimmed cap that was a common fixture for Macedonian colonists and soldiers. Displays of martial prowess and militarism are ever-present elements of Hellenistic monarchies, with their territory considered spear-won land, a phrase that is visually translated with Eucratides' aggressive pose. To my knowledge, there are almost no coins that show the king wearing such military garb for almost any other Hellenistic dynasty. The only exception is that of Timarchus, a rebellious Seleucid official who appears to have directly modeled his coins after those of Eucratides, and this trend would be carried forward by the Indo-Greek rulers as well. Perhaps this overt display is tied to the violent politics of the region. Skill in battle may have trumped dynastic loyalty or moral qualms about regicide. It could also be a choice born out of their cultural isolation, since by Eucratides' time they had been separated from the Seleucids due to the expansion of the Parthian Empire into the Iranian plateau. They may have wanted to present themselves as champions of Hellenic military culture. The choice of gods to present on the reverse of these coins also reflects this warlike attitude. Diodotus moved away from the seated Apollo, the dynastic god of the Seleucids, and replaced him with a standing Zeus wielding the thunderbolt. Euthydemus and Demetrius chose Heracles, the club-wielding monster slayer who traveled the globe. While Zeus and Heracles are among the most popular deities for the Greco-Bactrians and the Indo-Greeks, there are also other figures that appear in peculiar strikes. Antimachus I used Poseidon standing with a trident, perhaps referring to a river victory, or more likely the god's connection to horses and cavalry. Eucratides chose the Dioscuri, the twin brothers Castor and Pollux that were renowned horsemen, and they can also symbolize the importance of the joint kingship that Eucratides shared with his son. Along with its kings would be queens of Bactria, but we have very little to draw upon in terms of sources. Antiochus III is said to have promised his daughter's hand in marriage to Demetrius I, though we aren't given her name, nor do we have any explicit evidence that this promise was fulfilled. Only one woman makes an appearance on Greco-Bactrian coins, a lady named Laodike. She was clearly an important figure, as her profile appears alongside a man named Heliocles, but of the two, it is she who wears the royal diadem. Her name may reflect a Seleucid background, given the commonality of the Laodices among the women of that dynasty, and the supposed marriage between Antiochus's daughter and Demetrius, but nothing is certain. It's likely that the Greco-Bactrian kings married daughters and sisters of high-ranking Greek officials, but one cannot help but wonder if they also married highborn women from the local Bactrian and Sogdian communities to ensure political stability. Alexander took the hand of Roxana, the daughter of the powerful Oxyartes, and Seleucus was wed to Apama, the daughter of Spidomenes, a Sogdian warlord and fierce opponent of the Macedonian invaders. Given that one of the main functions of a king was to lead in battle, and how Bactria and war go hand in hand in our sources, it is worth considering the militaristic side of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. The ancient authors stress the large amounts of manpower that could be drawn from the region. Euthydemus is said to have been able to field 10,000 cavalrymen against Antiochus III at the Battle of the Aria River, an amount without parallel in any other contemporary engagement that would have required great resources to maintain. Justin claims that Eucrates endured a siege by the army of the Indo-Greek king Demetrius, which numbered 60,000 strong. As we have already discussed, Alexander and the early Seleucids oversaw an extensive settlement program and the establishment of military colonies. Presumably the sons of these veterans would have been enlisted into the army, and possible theories about the existence of a cleruchic system, whereby soldiers would be given land to supplement their income in return for a continual service, have been suggested, though not confirmed. The hiring of mercenaries may have been a suitable route to acquire new troops. A play of the comedian Menander, known as the Samia, and dated to the late 4th century, has the protagonist consider heading off to Bactria as a soldier for hire. While the scene is intended to be tongue-in-cheek, journeying to the east to ply one's trade as a mercenary was considered a plausible, if slightly excessive, career decision. In terms of their conduct in war, the Greco-Bactrian rulers probably continued to utilize the tried and true method of the Macedonian pike phalanx and heavy cavalry. A golden clasp recovered from Tilia Tepe and dating to the 1st century shows two warriors, dressed in the kit of a Hellenistic soldier, a muscle cuirass with rows of paterges, a Boeotian helmet, a military cloak, along with a spear and shield. A terracotta relief from Kempir Tempe shows a similar image, though dated closer to the 2nd century. This figure is more akin to a thureos, a type of soldier employed with a shorter sword and a large oval shield, bearing a resemblance to a Roman legionary or Celtic warriors. These were adopted by the Seleucid and Ptolemaic armies by the early 2nd century, and it must be presumed that either knowledge of these troop types was passed to Bactria, or perhaps mercenaries continued to flow into the region during this time. Eucrates' coins of the Dioscuri show cavalrymen wielding long pikes akin to the men serving as part of the royal agema or companion cavalry. While the Eucratid Dioscuri and the Tilia Tepe warriors are depicting mythological deities rather than actual Greco-Bactrian or Indo-Greek troops, they probably were modeled on equipment that was in use in the region during this time. It also is a testament to how Hellenistic arms and armor continue to persist and remain in the memory of Central Asian culture. In addition to the Greek colonists, the kings could call upon the native Bactrians and Sogdians to serve in substantial amounts. We know a lot more about their roles in Persian armies, but it probably did not differ too much in practice. In addition to fielding infantry, the tradition of horse-rearing in the area likely saw local Iranians serving in the cavalry in appropriately high numbers. Along with Bactrians, the hiring of troops from the tribes of the steppe was not opposed either. Documents recovered from Ai Khanoum include a receipt for the employment of Saka mercenaries, presumably providing service as heavy cavalry or mounted archers. Armor pieces from the city treasury were also discovered, and have been assessed as being part of the panoply of a cataphract, the heavily armed lancers that were cultivated on the steppe, and later adopted by the Seleucids and the Romans. Elephants have also been associated with Bactria as well. In 274, the Babylonian Chronicle records the governor of Bactria sending Antiochus I 20 elephants during the First Syrian War. It has been debated whether there was an actual elephant breeding facility like the one at Syrian Apamea. It is possible that the elephants of 274 were leftovers from the original 500 provided by Chandragupta Maurya to Seleucus I as part of the Treaty of the Indus in 303. By 206, however, Euthydemus was able to give Antiochus III an unknown number of elephants after the siege of Bactria, so whether he received them from one of the neighboring Indian lords or had been breeding them, they seem to have been employed to some extent. How Greek were the Greco-Bactrians? How Iranian? The question of identity is contentious, and given my discussions on both the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt, I hope that I've been able to illustrate the complexity of the idea of Hellenization. But with Greco-Bactria, and later the Indo-Greeks, it is incredibly intriguing to imagine something like Athens transplanted in Asia, but the meager amounts of evidence we have requires us to take a step back and carefully assess our findings. As I spoke earlier, Bactria saw an enormous wave of colonization during Alexander's conquest, so its Greek population was anything but inconsequential. In addition to their geographic displacement from Greece by thousands of miles, the early settlers of Bactria seem to have felt culturally isolated and deeply resented their alien environment. Diodorus directly lists one of the major reasons behind the mercenary revolt of 323 was because they longed to return to their homelands and Greek ways of life. Alexandria Eschkate in Sogdiana was viewed as the effective end of civilization. The Seleucid explorer Demadamus consecrated the furthest extent of his journey with stone altars dedicated to Apollo, much in the same vein as Alexander on the Hyphasis, to demarcate the borders of the known world. Because of this, it is not surprising that both the Seleucid and Greco-Bactrian rulers, along with the settlers and their descendants, sought to replicate or import much of the trappings of Hellenic culture. Located in the city center of Ai Khanoum is a great heroon, an enclosed shrine and tomb dedicated to a man named Canaeus. We have no idea who Canaeus was, but he clearly was an important member of the first wave of settlers. Inside the tomb, there is a marble slab inscribed with maxims of the Oracle of Delphi. It reads as follows, quote, "Speak well of everyone, be a lover of wisdom. These wise sayings of men of old, the maxims of renowned men, are enshrined in the holy Pytho, Delphi. There Clearchus copied them conscientiously, and he set them up here in the sanctuary of Canaeus, blazing them from afar. As a child, be well behaved. As a young man, self-controlled. In middle age, be just. As an elder, be of good counsel. And when you come to the end, be without grief." End quote. The message of Delphi, long considered to house the omphalos, or navel of the Greek world, was symbolically carried to Afghanistan. Indeed, many of the Seleucid coins show Apollo, the patron of Delphi and the Seleucid dynasty, seated upon the stone omphalos. Traditionally, Greek settlers would seek the blessings of the oracle residing at the temple before establishing a new colony. The dedicant, Clearchus, is often thought to be the peripatetic philosopher of the same name, though there is no definitive way to prove this, and some have argued it was placed there long after he had died. If we follow this line of reasoning, then this marker was established during the second expansion of Ai Khanoum into a royal capital. The Greek residents of Ai Khanoum were consciously linking themselves with the larger Hellenic community, retroactively incorporating it into their civic history. Along with the maxims of Delphi, there is other evidence of a Greek intellectual culture at Ai Khanoum. The existence of a theater, capable of seating 6,000 occupants, presumably means that plays were put on for the residents of both the city and the surrounding regions. Amazingly, 21 lines of iambic verse from an otherwise unknown tragedy have been recovered. Translations reveal that the subject matter is tied to the god Dionysius, an important deity in the Greek perception of the East. Euripides' Bacchae claims that Bactria was one of the places visited by the god of wine, and Alexander made major sacrifices in Dionysius' name while in Samarkand. King Pantaleon placed the bust of Dionysius on one of his coins to celebrate his conquests in India. Unfortunately, we are unable to draw any serious conclusions, but it is not the only piece of literature to be discovered. The assumption that the Clearchus of the Delphi inscriptions and the peripatetic philosopher are one and the same has tickled scholars' imagination with ideas of Greek philosophy being studied in Bactria. While the association of Clearchus is conjectural, there is far more evidence to demonstrate its reality. A substantially better preserved papyrus fragment from Ai Khanoum has 4 columns of text containing part of a philosophical treatise. The treatise is structured exactly like a Socratic dialogue, and the subject of the discussion is the Platonic theory of forms. Like with the Dionysian tragedy, this text is from an unknown work and authorship, though some have speculated that it could be a lost book of Aristotle. An attractive answer, since Clearchus of Soli was of the Peripatetic school, founded by the descendants of Aristotle's Lyceum. It is very possible that this is not an Aristotelian work, but an original by a Greco-Bactrian author. There also existed a gymnasium at Ai Khanoum, a quintessentially Greek institution not only intended to hone athletic ability, but also serve as part of the education of the younger Greek males of the community. An inscription on the bust found in the gymnasium indicates that it was dedicated by the brothers Trebalos and Strato to the gods Hermes and Heracles, patron deities of athletes. It appears that martial arts like boxing, wrestling, and pankration continue to be practiced in both Bactria and India. A small votive found in the Lalura district in Afghanistan shows 2 wrestlers engaged in a sparring contest, dated to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. On the votive is an inscription with a Kharosthi rendition of a Greek name, Menander, perhaps the name of the wrestler who dedicated an offering in honor of his victory. With regards to the religious life of the Greco-Bactrians, we know that the Olympians were carried to the east by the Greeks and worshipped and depicted in much the same fashion as they were back home. The inscription of Heliodotos honoring both Euthydemus and Demetrius I was consecrated at the altar of Hestia in a grove of Zeus. Funerary urns dated to the early 3rd century BC contain the cremated remains of 2 young children named Lysanias and Isadora, sharing the same burial practices as their forebears. Yet as we have seen in places like Egypt and Babylonia, the worship and veneration of the divine can manifest in ever-complex forms and blur the lines between Greek and non-Greek. At Ai Khanoum, there exists the remains of a religious sanctuary known as the Temple of Indented Niches. Given its size and prominence in the city, it is unusual to see that the temple is neither Greek nor Iranian in design, but bears its closest similarity to Mesopotamian architecture, namely through the indented niches on the exterior walls. Among the templed ruins is also the sandaled foot of an enormous stone cult statue. Carved onto the shoe is a thunderbolt, and a large flower with many petals. Based on the presence of the thunderbolt, some postulate that the temple was dedicated to the god Zeus. Perhaps it was a diodated dedication as seen with their use of Zeus on their coinage. However, the thunderbolt in conjunction with the flower gives the impression that it was more tied to fertility and springtime rather than the display of power and authority. It may indeed be a representation of the goddess Cybele, as supported by the discovery of a medallion of Cybele in the same room. Of course, there is nothing stopping devotees of other religious backgrounds worshipping in a temple that is of Hellenic, Iranian, or Mesopotamian origin. One may see Zeus where the other sees Mithra, and vice versa. Another important sanctuary was the Temple of the Oxus, built at Takht-i-Sangin during the early 3rd century BC. Its extremely large size and extensive fortifications, possessing an outer wall that required over 300,000 mud bricks, suggest that construction was funded by the royal patronage of the Seleucids. The temple ascribes very much to Iranian practice with some Greek influence, and while some originally believed it was a Zoroastrian temple, all evidence suggests that it was a sanctuary dedicated to the deified Oxus River. One example of the complexities of worship is the Marsyas votive, discovered in the ruins of the temple. A bronze figurine of Marsyas, a flute-playing satyr, was placed atop of a stone base and deposited in the temple sometime during the 2nd century. There is a Greek inscription upon its base that reads as follows, quote, Atrosokis dedicated this ex voto to the Oxus. Despite the use of the Greek language and the dedication of a Greek mythological figure, there is more to the picture. The name of the man who dedicated it, Atrosokis, is Bactrian in origin and means possessing the power of the divine fire. If Greek was a language of the elites, it certainly makes sense as to why this Bactrian would choose to use it in this act of piety. Atrosokis' offering harkens back to a long-standing local veneration of the Oxus River, which was the lifeblood of Bactria itself. Many of the names of the native Bactrians that have survived through administrative documents and written records are a testament to its importance. Oxyartes, Oxybazos, and Oxyboakes, to name a few. If we believe that the Temple of Indented Niches at Ai Khanoum was dedicated to Kibale, it may also be a stand-in for the deified Oxus, or perhaps the Iranian water goddess Anahita. The choice to use a figurine of Marsyas for a dedication to a river deity is curious but appropriate, since the satyr is associated with the Meander River in Asia Minor. A sculpted metal disc from eastern Iran shows a Seleucid war elephant, and upon its back is a cloth saddle with a rendering of a hippocampus, a water-dwelling fish-tailed horse commonly accompanying the god Poseidon. Given Bactria's association with elephants in its landlocked geography, it is quite possible that this hippocampus was directly evoking the Oxus. While the votive of Atrosokis can potentially be seen as an instance of Bactrian religious practices communicated through a Greek means, there is a similar example in the Temple of Apollo on the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea, one of the most important and renowned sanctuaries in the Greek world. Among its ruins are a list of inscriptions providing an inventory count of all major donations given to the temple. One was recorded in 179 BC, and reads, quote, "The upper part of a lion on a plinth, the dedication of Hyspasines, son of Mithroaxos, a Bactrian." Both Hyspasines and Mithroaxos are very much Iranian names, and if we are to assume that Atrosokis deposited his treasure in a temple of the deified Oxus, it seems somewhat unusual to have a Bactrian contribute to a very Hellenic sanctuary. However, the Seleucid dynasty viewed Apollo as a patron deity, and struck coins using the image of the bow-wielding god. It could directly evoke models of Iranian kingship, and so it is possible that Apollo still resonated with the Bactrians long after the Seleucids gave up control of the area. But there is also the question of how Hyspasines ended up at Delos, and how he identified himself culturally or ethnically. Was he a Bactrian immigrant, or merely a traveler? A Hellenized Bactrian that worshipped Greek gods? A mixed Greco-Bactrian ancestry? The possibilities are endless, and ultimately inconclusive. Without an abundance of papyrus fragments, our ability to understand the relationship between Greeks and Bactrians remains limited. Since the original colonists brought by Alexander and the Seleucids were largely male Greek soldiers and camp followers, it is therefore inevitable that mixed marriages with native Bactrian and Sogdian women would have occurred to some extent. In Hellenistic Egypt, we saw how mixed families and their descendants could play fast and loose with their concept of self-identity, being Greek or Egyptian whenever it seemed fit. It is likely that we have similar circumstances between the Greek and Iranian communities of the region. A useful case study can be found with the Branchidae, the descendants of Milesian Greeks settled by Xerxes in Sogdiana and later encountered by Alexander. After almost 150 years since they migrated from the Mediterranean, it appears that they still spoke Greek, but it had developed into a kind of Creole that borrowed heavily from local languages. They identified themselves as Hellenes, however, and their lifestyle and customs still resembled their ancestors. Not that this did anything to win the sympathy of the Milesians in Alexander's army, though. This sort of persistent civic identity is also hinted at by Polybius when he recounts Antiochus's invasion of Bactria. During the negotiations between the two kings, Euthydemus I attempted to establish a rapport with the Seleucid ambassador Teleus by pointing to a shared ancestry to the Greek city of Magnesia. As the excavations of Ai Khanoum have revealed, the upper and lower class incorporated both Hellenic and Central Asian material culture and designs into their homes. The political language and many of the city's most prominent public buildings are characteristically Greek, but the persistence of local customs and traditions is unmistakable, and whether we can attribute those choices to being a case of Bactrians Hellenizing or Greeks Orientalizing remains a mystery. As a brief aside, let me address the clothing of the Greco-Bactrians. More specifically, I am referring to the kausia, the hat worn by Macedonian commoners and nobles alike. The Persians even specifically called the peoples living in Macedonia Yona Takabara, the Greeks with shields on their heads. Along the border of southeastern Afghanistan and Pakistan, several modern ethnic groups like the Pashtuns or the Ko wear a popular headdress known as the pakol, a pie-shaped hat made of wool or felt. Some have noticed a resemblance between the pakol and the kausia, so much so that they've postulated that it was a cultural leftover from the Greek occupation of Bactria, or perhaps an export from the local Bactrians back to Macedonia. While it is an attractive idea, The pakol didn't really come into existence until the late 19th century in northern Pakistan, before spreading into Afghanistan in the late 1970s. Was there any tension between the Greek and Bactrian communities? The arrival of the Macedonian army in 329 was punctuated by years of brutal warfare and rebellions, which saw tens of thousands of Bactrians and Sogdians killed in the fighting. We aren't told of any further rebellions by indigenous leaders, though the Sogdians were able to separate themselves from the rule of the Greco-Bactrian kings around the time of Euthydemus I. Despite there being evidence of Bactrians serving as part of the administrative class, resentment must have certainly built up to some degree or another by the occupation and dominance of a culturally distinct group. One Bactrian custom that offended Greek sensibilities was their funerary practices, more specifically the corpse-eating dogs that were said to have roamed around Bactria. Bactria and the eastern Romanian plateau have often been considered the birthplace of the Zoroastrian religion, and the bone of contention between Greek polytheists and Zoroastrians was the practice of open-air exposure versus the cremation of dead bodies. Given the importance of the sacred fire as a symbol of Ahura Mazda, sullying the flames with human remains was and continues to be seen as a sacrilegious act by many Zoroastrians, who generally prefer that the dead be left out in the open and consumed by animals like carrion birds and dogs. Upon seeing this practice during his visit to Bactria, Alexander is said to have outlawed it out of disgust, which no doubt greatly incensed the local population. Interestingly, the Diodotids minted several bronze coins, species that was intended for local or regional use, and on the reverse is a depiction of Artemis, goddess of the hunt. Accompanying Artemis is a hunting dog, at least on earlier specimens, while later ones remove the dog but keep Artemis. One theory suggests that Diodotus may have abandoned the image of the dog, lest the Bactrians be reminded of the censorship of their religious beliefs and breed further resentment. Of considerable importance is the interaction between the Greco-Bactrians and the peoples of the steppe. Native Bactrians and Sogdians had long held a close economic and social relationship with the nomadic horse-rearing tribes living along the Eurasian grasslands. Strabo suggests that the Sogdians were almost indistinguishable from the nomads living across the Jaxartes River, though the Bactrians were more urbanized and therefore more civilized. In the Persian period, this relationship continued to function as per usual, albeit with some rough patches when those like Cyrus and Darius marched their armies in the region. The arrival of Alexander is thought to have seriously disrupted this network, as he and the later Seleucid kings would repeatedly clash with tribes like the Saka, the Dahai, and eventually the Parni. The foundation of Alexandria Eshkate, a military outpost intended to control or curb the movement of the nomads, may have been the final catalyst that caused the satrapy-wide revolt in Sogdiana during Alexander's campaigns. The Greeks took the nomadic threat quite seriously. One of the coins of Diodotus I, really issued by Diodotus II, displays a marker on the coin face that indicates a military victory. It is quite possible that Diodotus had successfully fought against the Parthians when they first emerged onto the scene, and he may have used that victory to claim the title of king, or perhaps Diodotus II retroactively championed his father's success to make his own bid for power. According to Polybius, Euthydemus I attempted to bargain for his position with Antiochus III by claiming that he alone was keeping the nomads of the steppes at bay. A united front against the likes of the Parthian and Saka would be mutually beneficial to the security of Asia. Euthydemus may have been only looking to protect his own interests, but there is a clear communication of his kingly role, and that of Antiochus, as the protector of the civilized world from the ravages of the barbarians. But we can also see that the Greco-Bactrian kings were more than willing to work with the nomads if needed, since there is a suggestion that Diodotus II and Arsaces I of Parthia may have formed a temporary alliance against Seleucus II. As I already relayed before, the hiring of Saka mercenaries and other nomadic tribes must have been attractive when the kings saw the potential of incorporating horse archers or cataphracts into their fold. No doubt, the Greco-Bactrians would also wish to keep the nomads at arm's length, so they could get access to the fine horses raised by these communities to furnish for their armies as well. The connection between Bactria and the nomads is what leads us to the final part of this episode. As we discussed, the Golden Age under the reign of Eucratides I came to a violent end when he was assassinated by his own son after returning from India in approximately 145 BC. The name of this parricide is uncertain, as Justin does not give us enough details, though there are a couple of potential culprits. A successor named Eucratides II makes an appearance, strongly suggesting that he was a blood relative or a son of his namesake. Another is Heliocles I, the man who most scholars consider to be the last Greek ruler of Bactria. His epithet Dikaios translates to the just, a fitting moniker if he was the one to overthrow the murder of Eucratides, or, perhaps, propaganda to cover up his crime. There is no certainty as to his relationship with Eucratides, though some may point to the commemorative coins of Heliocles and Laodike as proof of familial ties, which, as we've already discussed, is a problematic assumption to begin with. His reign, lasting from roughly 145 to 130, saw the end of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom due to a multitude of factors. One of the major threats to the security of Bactria was the neighboring Arsacid realm of Parthia. At the same time that Eucratides came to power, Parthia saw the rise of Mithridates I, one of the Arsacid dynasty's most capable rulers. The expansion of Parthia from a regional kingdom to a major empire was due in part to the collapse of Seleucid authority in Iran and Mesopotamia following the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 164 and the civil wars that followed. Both he and Eucratides shared the same moniker, the Great, as they no longer viewed the Seleucids as a serious challenge to their autonomy while they were tied up by familial squabbles in Syria. But Eucratides' repeated wars have left his kingdom vulnerable to attack as well. While he was out campaigning in India, Mithridates chose to invade and seize parts of western Bactria and Aria in the early 140s, and a later Armenian chronicle claims that the Parthian ruler made it as far as Bactra. This might be attested to by a coin minted by Mithridates with an elephant on the reverse, perhaps signifying the victory over the Bactrians. While the Parthian invasions gnawed away at Eucratides' holdings, Mithridates was only able to incorporate the areas of Aria and Margiana into his domain. Of a more pressing matter for the Greco-Bactrians came from the north, beyond the Oxus and Jaxartes. For several decades, the Eurasian steppes have been undergoing a dramatic restructuring thanks to a combination of military, political, and environmental pressures. In the late 3rd century, a powerful nomadic confederation known as the Xiongnu emerged on the Mongolian steppes and established a vast empire that posed a serious threat to his neighbors, including the Han Chinese. As the reach of the Xiongnu expanded west, they encountered and defeated other nomadic tribes, namely the Wusun and Yuezhi confederations situated at the mouth of the Gansu corridor. Between 176 and 160 BC, the Yuezhi pushed west past the Tianshan Mountains and settled near the Pamir mountain range in the Fergana Valley. This domino effect of migrating tribes was felt in Central Asia as well, as the Yuezhi displaced the Saka and other nomadic groups, who were sent southwards into Sogdiana and, ultimately, Bactria. Strabo names 4 different tribes that helped topple the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom: the Asians, the Passianians, the Sakaraukians, and the Tocharians. He clearly distinguishes them from the Saka, noting that they came from the lands beyond the Jaxartes. This migration was also confirmed by the accounts of Chinese historians, and while it is difficult to try and firmly connect the Chinese terms with those of the Greco-Romans, most accept that the Tocharians, Tokharoi in Greek, should be identified with the Yuezhi. The movement of these peoples occurred over many years, but archaeological evidence may point to a firmer date of the nomadic invasion of Bactria. This we can find in Ai Khanoum, which was abandoned by 145. One of the last written documents of the city is a treasury record dated to year 24. This means either that a king was in his 24th year of rule at the time it was copied down, or it was the 24th year of a Greco-Bactrian or Indo-Greek era, modeled after the Seleucid era. Most believe this to be a marker for the reign of Eucratides, which would be approximately 146 or 145, and so it also forms the chronological marker for the end of Ai Khanoum, and the approximate end of Eucratides' reign. Of all the known coin hoards discovered in the city, no coins minted after Eucratides have been found among them. The defensive walls display signs of damage from fire and warfare, with arrowheads of Scythian design having been discovered in the rubble as well. All evidence suggests that the inhabitants quickly abandoned the city at this time, though this was followed by a brief period of reoccupation. A likely second attack caused significant damage, and a great fire swept throughout the city shortly thereafter, thus ending the life of Ai Khanoum. The Saka were soon followed by the Yuezhi, who permanently settled in Bactria by the late 130s, and would eventually establish the Kushan Empire. The turmoil afflicting the realm during the reign of Heliocles may be reflected in his coin dies, the tools used to strike images and inscriptions on coins. Studies show that there is a very high percentage of error among the dies used to mint Heliocles' coins, with nearly 20% of them showing spelling mistakes and other flaws. For perspective, the second highest error rate of 15% could be found among the dies of Antimachus I, but this can be accounted for by the fact that there are only around 20 specimens for Antimachus compared to 180 for Heliocles. It seems that Heliocles was in desperate need to strike coins in great numbers, as would be the case if he was pressured to try and provide pay for soldiers to be deployed in either the civil wars or in any battles with the Parthians and the nomads. The high percentage suggests poor quality control, born out of a demand for high volumes at the cost of aesthetic quality, a lack of government oversight, or both. The discovery of several coin hoards dating to this period, buried by their owners out of fear of being robbed or looted, also indicates the level of general instability of the period. Attributing the lion's share of the blame to the nomads for the fall of Greco-Bactria is tempting, and certainly holds great merit given the evidence from both the historical and the archaeological record, since both Strabo and Pompeius Trogus consider the Saka and other groups to be the largest culprits behind the kingdom's collapse. There are many parallels between the end of Bactria and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, but like with the fall of Rome, the barbarian migrations form a piece of the larger puzzle. As we have seen, the political environment of Greco-Bactria was turbulent. Hellenistic monarchies tended to be warlike and violent even in the best of times, but the Bactrian rulers seemed particularly ambitious in this matter. Euthydemus I overthrew the last Diotodid king, Eucratides ousted the Euthydemids in his bid for power, and was in turn assassinated by his own son. The Greco-Bactrian kings directly competed with the Indo-Greek rulers, and each competed amongst themselves. Keep in mind, this is only what we are told from literary accounts. If we had more, I almost certainly guarantee that there would have been plenty more instances of dynastic squabbling. The damage inflicted to the fortifications of Ai Khanoum can be tied to stone missiles from field artillery like catapults and siege equipment, which aren't really tools associated with the nomadic way of war. Perhaps this was the result of a siege by a Greco-Bactrian king engaged in a civil war following the murder of Eucratides. Justin recognized that the wars of Eucratides, be they rebellions after his usurpation of the previous king or the conquests he waged abroad, had sapped the military manpower of the kingdom that was necessary to protect itself. Already under immense pressure, the intrusion of the nomads proved just too much for an unstable system. We must also reconsider the notion that Greco-Bactria ended with the abandonment of Ai Khanoum and the demise of Heliocles I. The arrival of the Saka and the Yuezhi did not obliterate Greek culture from existence, and there is plenty of evidence to show that it continued to survive in Bactria for many decades following, which we will spend time extensively covering later. Cohabitation between the Greeks, nomads, and local Bactrians must have taken place, and the degree of violence or cooperation between these groups can only be surmised. One cannot help but wonder if the native Bactrians took part in the destruction of the city, given the seemingly deliberate large-scale damage inflicted upon the palace and other important civic buildings, a possible consequence of perceived or real inequality. We know that the nomads occupied Ai Khanoum for a time. Several graves found within the city dating to this period share strong similarities to the Kurgan burials of the steppe, and one occupant even displays sign of artificial cranial deformation, a custom practiced by many nomadic tribes, including the famous Huns. Excavations in Sogdiana have complicated the picture further. Unlike Bactria, there does not appear to be a wave of destruction dating to this period. If anything, there seems to be an increased presence of Greek occupation during the mid-2nd century. Following the reconquest of Sogdiana by Eucratides, it is suggested that many Greeks fled north from Bactria to the Sogdian settlements after the nomads invaded. More famous were the Indo-Greek kingdoms of Pakistan and northwest India, which survived until the beginning of the 1st century AD, and is a topic we will approach in a few episodes. While the silence of Bactria is felt all too powerfully in the works of Greco-Roman authors, we can rely on another voice to fill in the picture. Shortly after the fall of the last Greek king of Afghanistan, the Han Chinese would reach the lands of Dasha and Dayuan, a transformative event that would affect the history of Bactria and the rest of Eurasia for centuries to come. Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 76, Greco-Bactria, Han China, and the War of the Heavenly Horses. In the year 128 BC, a Chinese diplomat named Zhang Chen had reached the eastern end of the Fergana Valley in modern Kazakhstan. He had traveled many thousands of li from the court of the Emperor Wu Di in Chang'an in pursuit of one goal: contact the Yueshi and Wusun nomads who lived within the lands of Dayuan, and establish an alliance against the Xiongnu barbarians that had threatened the Middle Kingdom for decades. No doubt those in the Emperor's retinue thought he was long dead, his journey interrupted by an extended stay against his will in the Xiongnu capital. While he met with the Yueshi without much success, our plucky diplomat returned to the Emperor in 126 with news of a land of riches. More specifically, he was speaking of Bactria and its surrounding regions. Zhang Chen holds the distinction of being the first documented visitor from the Chinese Empire of the Han dynasty to Central Asia, which had just experienced the fall of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. This marked the beginning of a transformative period that saw increased connectivity between China and the so-called Western regions, which would ultimately result in the forging of an economic network that would reach from East Asia to the Mediterranean world. Zhang's report, recorded by later Chinese historians, is one of the only contemporary accounts of post-Greek Bactria, making the fall of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom the first event in world history recorded by both Asian and European authors. In this episode, we will discuss the first Chinese excursions into Central Asia, looking at the expeditions of Zhang Chen and others to not only get an idea of the events surrounding the fall of Greco-Bactria and its immediate aftermath, but also the earliest encounters between the Chinese and Greco-Roman worlds. As a forewarning, my pronunciation of Chinese terms and names is going to be less than ideal, but I will encourage all of you to check out my transcript if you have any questions about who exactly or what exactly I am referring to. Before we return to where we left off in the narrative of Bactria, we need to understand the circumstances that ultimately led to Chinese interest in Central Asia. The rich history of the peoples and states that arose out of the alluvial plains of the Yellow River Basin has often presented the illusion of near-constant unification across millennia. In truth, while the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties were impressive political entities, China was divided for much of the first millennium. Though we may use the catch-all term Chinese, these peoples refer to themselves by their regional identities like Chu, Wei, or Qin. This is no different than our grouping of the Greeks, who would probably first describe themselves as Boeotians or Laconians before calling themselves Hellenes. From the 5th to the 3rd centuries, China was gripped in the Warring States period, when the once powerful king of the Zhou dynasty was reduced to a mere figurehead in the contests of 7 major regional states. Of these 7, it would be the Qin that emerged out of the fighting as the master of the Middle Kingdom. In 247-246, a young Zhao Zheng became the king of the Qin, the largest and most powerful of the competing realms. Despite only being 13 years old and with much of his power in the hands of a minister, Zhao nevertheless proved to be a highly intelligent and utterly ruthless figure, seeking to establish his authority lest he be swallowed up by those looking to capitalize on his supposed weakness. After coming of age, he immediately disposed of his political rivals while recruiting brilliant officials to help facilitate the development of his realm. One by one, Zhao eliminated the various factions, consolidating their territory into his own before finally conquering the last remaining state of Qi in 221. Commemorating his newly uncontested position, Zhao took the name Qin Shi Huangdi, a title crafted from the words Huang, august or splendid, and Di, a type of deity, becoming the first emperor of China. This new imperial office would serve as the model of Chinese political authority for the next 2,000 years. As emperor, Qin Shi would enact a series of reforms to transform and strengthen his empire. A standardization of weights, measures, letters, and currency, along with the development of administrative and legal institutions. Despite the immeasurable impact of the Qin on the Chinese state, their reign would last for less than 2 decades. Qin Shi Huangdi died of old age in 210, but his successor was murdered in 207, and the final Qin emperor was deposed less than a few months into his reign in 206. Civil war soon followed afterwards, before ultimately being settled by the accession of Liu Bang, the founder of what would be known as the Han dynasty, which oversaw the classical period of Chinese civilization across their 400 years of rule. Like their Greco-Roman contemporaries, the Qin and Han believed themselves to be a bastion of civilization surrounded by barbarians. The term the Chinese use to describe the empire is Zhongguo, often translated as central or middle kingdom, and reflects their geographic notion of the world. As one radiated from the center, the lands and its inhabitants became less civilized and more populated with barbarians. The most savage of all of these peoples would be the various nomadic tribes living along the grasslands of the steppes, who the Chinese held a complex relationship with. On one hand, they were alien to the concept of civilized society, viewed as a nuisance at best and an existential threat at worst. Tens of thousands of nomadic warriors who were expert riders and hardened by life on the steppes could raid into the Chinese countryside and seize plunder and captives, only to return to the grasslands before any armies were mustered to meet them. The Great Wall, as we know it today, is largely the byproduct of work done by the Ming dynasty in the 14th and 15th centuries AD, but the Qin and Han ordered the building of fortifications along many of the same routes with the intent to protect against forays from the nomads, using watchtowers and ramparts to control the movement of the tribes. On the other hand, the nomads could be often valuable trading partners who sought goods produced by the sedentary communities, providing access to their fine horse stocks or mercenaries for military service in return. Like the Scythians who dwelled along the Pontic-Caspian steppes, the line between nomad and sedentary communities could be quite blurry, as there was a gradient of lifestyles that may have not easily fallen into one category or the other. The policy of the later Han emperors was to try to establish some sort of buffer zone between them and the nomads, placing military colonists in border regions that could act as a line of defense while still able to engage in commercial and agricultural activities. Control of these border zones was the goal of the Chinese government, to varying degrees of success. At the time of the Qin, there were multiple tribes living in the steppes bordering China: the Yueshi, the Wusun, the Qiang, and the Xiongnu. The Yueshi were the most powerful, and controlled the Gansu Corridor, a highway that connected the cities of the Tarim Basin with the rest of East Asia, allowing them to grow rich off the trade of valuable goods like jade. On the other end of the scale were the Xiongnu, who originated from the lands of modern Mongolia and were the weakest of the various tribes. Chinese scholars describe them as being utterly nomadic in custom, wallowing in abject poverty and completely lacking any common decency. Life on the steppes was tough, but the Mongolian plains are even less hospitable than the Pontic-Caspian steppe, subject to greater aridity and temperature extremes. Any climatic fluctuations can result in a perennial dry season or exceptionally brutal winters. Pressure from both the Yueshi and the Qin was only aggravating these problems further, and ended up displacing the Xiongnu from their ancestral lands. The fate of the tribe looked bleak, but in the 210s there emerged a figure known as Modu, son of the reigning Xiongnu chieftain. Tactically brilliant and politically merciless, Modu had his own father murdered in 209 and took the title of Shanyu, becoming the supreme leader of his tribe. He carried his people in a series of spectacular campaigns against the Yueshi, driving their former rivals further west with each passing year. The civil war that broke out after the death of the last Qin emperor allowed the Xiongnu to regain their foothold and launch punitive expeditions to conquer Chinese territory. Han armies sent to fight this new menace were either rendered ineffectual or wiped out completely by the tactical brilliance of Modu Shanyu. At its peak, the Xiongnu Empire stretched across much of East Asia and possessed hundreds of thousands of warriors from a variety of backgrounds, a prototype for the later Mongol Empire. Such was the power of the Xiongnu that he could command a high price for peace between the Xiongnu and the Han. To keep the hordes at bay, the emperor was expected to bribe the nomads, or, from the perspective of the Xiongnu, pay tribute to them with an assortment of goods: money, finished products like jewelry and clothing, unlucky Chinese princesses, and thousands upon thousands of bolts of silk. The inclusion of princesses on the list of demands was particularly embarrassing for the Han, but the cost of doing business was arguably lower than ordering the expensive mobilization of troops against the Xiongnu, and had a better guarantee for peace. Yet the price grew steeper with each successive payment, much to the humiliation and fury of the emperors, and many subordinate vassals of the Xiongnu continued their attacks against the Han without reprisal, regardless of any treaty signed. It is during the reign of the 7th Han Emperor Wu Di, who took the throne in about 141 BC, that the Chinese would try to free themselves from the blackmail of the nomads. Far more militarily minded than his predecessors, Emperor Wu Di refused to put up with the growing demands of the Xiongnu, and sought to restore China's prestige and position as the uncontested master of the region. Though the emperor could draw from a pool of hundreds of thousands of conscripted soldiers, the Chinese army was relatively lacking in sufficient cavalry needed to try and match the horsemen of the Xiongnu, but he might have been able to mitigate the issue by looking to outside parties to meet his needs. During the expansion of the Xiongnu, the other tribes of the steppe, like the Wusun and Yuezhi, were driven out of their former homes, and gradually pushed into the Tarim Basin. A final decisive blow came in the 170s, when the chieftain of the Yuezhi was killed in battle, and had the privilege of his skull being turned into the new drinking cup of the second Xiongnu. This provided sufficient motivation for the tribe to keep moving into Central Asia along the corridors of the steppe, far out of the reach of the Xiongnu. Of course, this resulted in a domino effect over the next few decades, which led them into conflict with the established groups like the Saka, ultimately contributing to the fall of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom in the 140s or 130s, as they were weakened by the subsequent arrival and settlement of the nomads. Emperor Wu Di was keenly aware of the migration of these steppe tribes into lands unknown, thanks to the interrogation of captured Xiongnu, hoping that they would adhere to the maxim, "the enemy of my enemy," and form an alliance with the Han against the Xiongnu. A solid plan in theory, but how exactly it was supposed to be carried out remained problematic, as no Chinese representative had made direct contact with the Yuezhi in over 30 years. The lands west of the Tarim Basin were virtually unknown in any official capacity, and so Wu Di needed to send out an expedition to explore the western regions to carry his message to the Wusun and Yuezhi. Enter Zhang Qian. A palace attendant at the court of Chang'an, Zhang was knowledgeable about the Xiongnu given his military service, and considered especially trustworthy in carrying out the emperor's will. In about 138, he and a Xiongnu slave named Gan Fu set out on an imperial commission with 100 men to cross the Tarim Basin in search of the Wusun and Yuezhi. Despite their best efforts to avoid any unwanted attention, they were discovered by Xiongnu scouts on the initial leg of their journey and brought before the Xiongnu, who was understandably annoyed at the Han government's attempts to circumvent his authority. They were detained in the Xiongnu's capital, and to encourage his complicity in his new velvet prison, Zhang Qian was even given a Xiongnu wife, whom he later fathered a child with. After 10 years of captivity, however, Zhang and Gang Fu managed to escape by taking advantage of the relaxed demeanor of their guards. By traveling for over a month through the Tian Shan Mountains, the pair had reached their ultimate destination, the grasslands of the Fergana Valley. Zhang's recountings of his journeys and the official report for the emperor were preserved by later Chinese authors, who sometimes directly quoted the work in their own texts. The first of these was Sima Cheng. the author of the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, composed in the early 1st century BC. In Book 123, the account of Da Yuan, Shima dedicates an entire chapter discussing the earliest contacts of the Chinese with the peoples of Central Asia and beyond, and extensively paraphrased Zhang's report. There are a surprising amount of observations in the text that are parallel to the Greco-Roman sources and archaeological evidence, but it must be noted that like any historical account, we need to exercise a degree of caution when trying to apply it too literally. Shima does not appear to have been particularly approving of Zhang's mission or the Central Asian policies of Wu Di. In his report, Zhang Qian provides the geographic names of all the places he visited or was aware of during his western travels: Dayuan, Kanju, Dayueshe, Dasha, Angshi, Shendu, and Tiaoshe. Dayuan probably refers to the Fergana Valley, as there is also the existence of a Kangju, which could be the region surrounding Samarkand, so both together form the bulk of Sogdiana. The name Da Yuan is particularly interesting. The translation of Da from the Old Chinese means great or big. Yuan, however, bears an uncanny resemblance to the term Yona or Yavanna, the Iranian and Sanskrit name for Greek, based on the word Ionian, hence Great Land of the Yuan. Given the possible increased Hellenic presence in Sogdiana following the collapse of Bactria, one can't help but wonder if Zhang Qian named the country after its Hellenic inhabitants. Such was the case for the Dayueshe, the lands of northern Bactria that were occupied by the Yuetian nomads. Dasha is explicitly described as being south of the river Gui, the Oxus or Amudarya, and the state of the Great Yueshi, containing the capital of Lanshi, Bactra. Angshi is almost certainly a transliteration of the term Arshak, the name of the founder of the Arsakid dynasty, and thus refers to Parthia. Shendu is clearly meant to be India, and Tiaozhe is said to be west of Angshi, likely referring to the broader region of Mesopotamia in Iran. Upon his arrival in Fergana, Zhang is said to have met with the king of Dayuan, who provided him guides and interpreters to help him explore the area. He first traveled to Kangju, before moving to the court of the Yueshi. The king at the time was the son of the previous Yueshi chieftain who had his skull turned into the Chanyu's goblet, but he was not interested in pursuing any sort of alliance given the distance of the Han and the power of the Xiongnu. Besides, he was perfectly content with his new home, as the lands he and his tribe now occupied were quite wealthy and fertile. Disappointed, Zhang and Gongfu spent the next year traveling throughout Central Asia, but especially in Bactria. Though he was probably considered a lost cause by the emperor and his court, the envoys decided to return to China through a different route, but had the misfortune of being captured once again by the Xiongnu scouts. Zhang Qian, Gongfu, and even Zhang's wife and child were able to escape the capital of the nomads a year later thanks to the outbreak of a civil war following the death of the Chanyu, and returned to Chang'an by the end of 126, delivering his report to the no doubt shocked Emperor Wu Di nearly 13 years following his initial departure. What did Zhang have to say about the peoples of Central Asia and the surrounding regions? According to the report, Dayuan is fairly populated and contained fortified settlements occupied by farmers tilling the land, but there was clear evidence of nomadic customs. In his description of Bactria, he notes that it was extremely prosperous, with several cities and a population of 1 million subjects, which lines up nicely with Strabo and Justin's descriptions of the land of 1,000 cities. Zhang is more dismissive of the Bactrians' martial valor, noting that they were weak in arms but capable merchants, and were more sedentary in lifestyle than those of Dayuan. He was surprised at the amount of Chinese goods that were in the markets of Bactra, and it was explained to him that they were acquired from outposts in India. Zhang was also aware that the Yueshi had invaded and toppled the previous rulers of Bactria, thus confirming the descriptions of the Greek and Roman authors about the collapse of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. Perhaps his most revealing observations are on the Parthians. Zhang claimed that the Angshi had hundreds of walled cities, and minted silver and gold coins with the portrait of the king, something that was not a custom of the Chinese, who generally issued coins that were made of bronze or other alloys and had a square-shaped hole punch marked into them. Grapes, the first he had ever seen, were cultivated to produce the wine in the areas surrounding Dayuan. Based on what we stereotypically think of Hellenistic civilizations, Zhang's account is spot on. Sima Qian acknowledges that while the languages of Central Asia were somewhat different, they were at least mutually intelligible, and the populace tended to share similar cultural practices. This has led some to speculate that this may be a reference to the use of Greek as a lingua franca, but it isn't too clear, as Strabo himself commented how the Bactrians and Sogdians spoke near identical dialects. For the lands that were outside of his itinerary, the descriptions are a little bit more fantastical in nature, though he does manage to get some common ideas across. Zhang's description of Tiaozhi, referring to Mesopotamia, does correctly state that it was under the vassalage of the Parthians, who moved into the area following the collapse of Seleucid power in Babylonia. He likewise notes that the Indian kings of Shendu ride into battle on elephants, an observation also frequently cited by Greco-Roman authors. But while the alliance with the nomads ultimately came to naught, there was one detail in Zhang's report that would attract the attention of the emperor. In the grasslands of the Fergana Valley, there was a breed of horse that would come to be known as the heavenly horses that sweat blood. The name was derived from Zhang's description, which stated that the horses were descendants of divine stallions, while the 13th century Venetian merchant Marco Polo believed that the stallions of Bactria and Sogdiana were sired by Alexander's loyal steed Bucephalus. The reference to the sweating of blood may actually have a biological explanation. Parafilaria multipapiliosul, a parasitic nematode that burrows into the skin and creates nodules or sores which leak, creating the illusion when the horses exerted themselves in the pasture. Chinese military tradition never particularly emphasized heavy cavalry prior to the 2nd century, due to the small size of their mounts. Exceptionally large and healthy, the breed of Fergana could travel great distances without tiring thanks to their stocky frame, despite being over 5 feet in height, and could also bear heavier loads. Part of the reason that these horses were so fit was due to a steady diet of alfalfa sprouts growing wild in the valley, which tend to be more nutrient-dense than other grasses. Horse domestication and riding were cultivated on the steppe, and so it was only natural that they mastered the process of horse rearing, selectively breeding over generations to produce this fine stock. A similarly featured breed known as the Nisaean horses were prized in the Mediterranean and Near East, and cultivated along the grasslands of the Caspian Sea. Wu Di immediately recognized the military potential of the heavenly horses, a tool to counteract the cavalry of the Xiongnu. Bactria was also politically divided and wealthy, eager for Chinese products. This proved to be a potent combination for the martial emperor, as Sima Qian put it. Quote, "Thus the emperor learned of Da Yuan, Dasha, Angxi, and the others, all great states rich in unusual products. All of these states, he was told, were militarily weak and prized Han goods and wealth. If it were only possible to win over these states by peaceful means, the emperor thought, he could then extend his domain 10,000 li, attract to his court men of strange customs who would come translating and retranslating their languages, and his might would become known to all the lands within the 4 seas." End quote. For the next several decades, imperial policy towards the western regions was dictated by the emperor's desire for more of these horses, which also meant securing control of the Gansu corridor. Campaigns were waged against the Xiongnu from 123 to 119, which allowed the Han to expand their western frontier at great cost in both lives and money. In 118-117, Wu Di appointed Zhang Qian as the head of a much larger embassy that was intended to visit the kingdom of the Wusun nomads in the Tarim Basin, a large oval-shaped piece of land situated between the northern Tian Shan Mountains and the southern Kunlun Mountains. Most of its 1,500-kilometer or 932-mile breadth is encompassed by the desolate Taklamakan Desert, but several kingdoms and peoples occupied the oases settled along the basin's rim. As the only overland route between East and Central Asia outside of immediate Xiongnu control, it was vital that the Chinese gather allies to allow for the passage of troops and officials. Presented with bolts of silk, gold pieces, and the hand of a Han princess, the king of the Wusun agreed to an alliance, providing military protection and thousands of hardy steppe ponies to add to the army's cavalry stock. Unfortunately, the perceptive Xiongnu quickly dispatched a bride of their own to the Wusun, and so both the emperor and the Chanyu would have to compete to gain the loyalty of the various states of the Tarim Basin. In the meanwhile, embassies between the Han court and the various states of Central Asia continued to flow unimpeded, and gradually grew quite large. Sima Qian comments disapprovingly that a flurry of opportunistic merchants and low-ranking government officials continually sought to embark on expeditions to the western regions in search of fame and fortune. Problems soon emerged when opportunistic tribes and bands of Xiongnu began to descend upon the Chinese travelers to seize their goods and take captives. In response to their predation, Wu Di became more aggressive in his push to incorporate the Tarim Basin into his sphere of influence, campaigning against both the Xiongnu and local peoples who were unwilling to submit to his authority. Even in the final decade of the 2nd century, the emperor was still very keen on acquiring Fergana horses, and so in 106 he sent a mission to Sogdiana carrying 1,000 gold pieces and a gold equine statue, gifts for the king of Dayuan if he was willing to provide some of his finest stallions and mares. According to Chinese accounts, the Council of Dayuan advised the king to reject the offer, pointing out the vast distance separating them from the Chinese and the hazardous trek through the Tarim Basin. Retaliation from the Han was unlikely, and to hand over one of their key military advantages to the emperor was a huge mistake, so they told the envoys to go back home. Out of anger, the Chinese ambassadors smashed the golden horses to bits before they departed, and in retaliation, the Council of Dayuan had them murdered. Once Emperor Wu Di heard of the rejection of his goodwill and the fate of his ambassadors, he flew into a violent fury. In 104, a great expeditionary force was summoned to either lay waste to Dayuan or conquer it outright, thus beginning what was to be called the War of the Heavenly Horses. The initial army sent to attack the western regions struggled greatly with the crossing of the Tarim Basin, suffering huge losses from a lack of supplies and the hostility of the environment. Wu Di was undeterred, and much to the dismay of his own advisors, he organized an even larger body of soldiers numbering over 50,000 men, and a great amount of pack animals and supplies. This was the most expensive campaign ever conducted by the Han up to that point, a testament to the emperor's dogged determination. Eventually, the Chinese armies had pushed far enough to reach the highly fortified city of Urshi, the capital of Dayuan. Besieged for over a month, the inhabitants of Urshi wished to make terms with the Han general, and so they murdered their king as a gesture of good faith, and offered to give up their horses, though, notably, they provided this information along with a gentle threat of possible reinforcements from Kongju to encourage the peace talks. After 4 years of campaigning in the west, the war was brought to a close. In addition to 3,000 heavenly horses, a puppet ruler was placed upon the Dayuan throne, and Fergana became a tributary of the Han Empire. Based on the city's size and reported defenses, it is very possible that Urshi is actually Alexandria Eshkate. To imagine that the descendants of Greek colonists planted by Alexander and his successors, still equipped in the arms and armor of their ancestors, doing battle with soldiers of the Han Emperor, is certainly a romantic idea, though one we can't really confirm. The War of the Heavenly Horses was not the last time the Han campaigned in Central Asia. In the mid-1st century, a Xiongnu prince named Zheje had been driven into Sogdiana thanks to a civil war that had broke amongst his tribe, and he was on the losing end against a Chinese-backed rival. After establishing himself near Lake Balakash in modern Kazakhstan, Zheje allied with the nation of Kongju, which could provide tens of thousands of mounted archers should he call for aid. The Protector General of the Han Central Asian Territory, Gan Yenshu, and his deputy, Cheng Tang, considered this a grave threat to Chinese interests in the region, and so in 36 BC, a large army of Chinese soldiers and allies from the Tarim Basin launched an attack against the displaced Xiongnu and Kongju warriors near the modern city of Taraz along the Talas River. The engagements eventually culminated in a siege, where the Han were successfully able to repel counterattacks from the Kongju, and Zheje was slain by a strained arrow as his fortress was lost. This was the most westward Chinese military operation to ever be conducted, only matched later by the Battle of Talas River between the armies of the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century AD. In the description of the battle, there is a curious reference to a display done by infantry troops outside of the gates of the fortress. The Chinese describe this group of 100 soldiers as performing a fish scale maneuver, their shields locked together as they marched about like scales of a large carp. According to a theory proposed by a sinologist named Homer Dubbs in the 1950s, these fish-scale soldiers could possibly be referring to Roman legionaries and their testudo formation, a series of interlocking rectangular shields in a box-like formation that allowed its users to protect against missiles and other weapons. But why would legionaries be this far from Rome? Well, about a decade earlier in 53 BC, the Roman commander Marcus Licinius Crassus was defeated at the Battle of Carrhae in a failed invasion of the Parthian Empire. 10,000 Romans were reportedly captured in the aftermath, and were said to have been shipped off to the city of Merv. If the battle took place less than a few decades later, it wouldn't be unreasonable to suggest that many of these Romans were still alive. And Merv is relatively close enough to Sogdiana to warrant the possibility that they escaped to Samarkand, and sought employment as mercenaries. Such an interpretation requires many assumptions and leaps of faith, however, and is one that I consider to be highly unlikely. If we continue to lean on a Mediterranean origin, it has also been postulated that the description is that of a Macedonian-styled phalanx, employed by the Hellenic descendants living in Samarkand and the rest of Sogdiana. Most ancient accounts of the phalanx emphasize the mass of spears rather than interlocking shields, though. And while it is a far more reasonable answer than Crassus's lost legionaries, it still is entirely speculative. And the Greeks did not hold a monopoly on shield formations. Such is the extent of Chinese interaction in post-Greek Central Asia, and while there are a few bits here and there that will be incorporated into the narrative of the Indo-Greeks, we will consider this to be the end of this particular discussion. But now comes the question, was there any evidence of trade or cultural transmission between China and Hellenistic Bactria? As I have already shown, Zhang Qian was the first known Chinese official to visit Bactria. But it is quite possible that a few Chinese merchants, or more likely Central Asian intermediaries who traded goods in the Tarim Basin, managed to get their hands on Greek goods and wares prior to this period. As the main artery of travel and trade between China and the rest of Central Asia, do we have any evidence of Hellenic influence in the Tarim Basin? Excavations have been undertaken in the 1980s at Sampul, a settlement of the southern part of the basin in the modern autonomous province of Xinjiang in western China. Several tombs of Saka origin dating between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC have been uncovered, which have produced an exciting array of materials that reflects the amount of cultural exchange and activity within the area. The most visually striking of these are textile pieces from the burial shrouds and clothing of the deceased. While the Saka and Scythians long possessed a tradition of rich designs and patterns, these specimens are quite distinct for the unmistakable influence of Hellenistic mythological scenes and motifs, such as centaurs and pegasi. The artistic presence of these centaurs is also fascinating when we take into consideration a Chinese account in the records of the Three Kingdoms, which gives interesting details about an unknown country to the west that was apparently full of horseman hybrids. Quote, "The elder of Wusun says that there is a country named Ma Jin in the northern Dingling. The upper parts of their body from the knees upwards are human, but they have the shins and hooves of a horse, with fur below their legs, so they run quickly as a horse." End quote. From a textile recovered from the site of Lulan along the Luobupo or Lop Nur Lake, we can clearly see the god Hermes with his twisted staff. Another important find was a grave of the so-called Yingpang man, an elite male Saka that was buried sometime around 100 BC, and his clothing shows rich hunting scenes that are almost identical to those found in Macedonia, with nude warriors wielding lances against their prey. Besides the Greek elements, there are other influences that line up with the cosmopolitan nature of the area, such as roundels and rosettes that were popular in Persian artwork. On the same tapestry that shows the image of a centaur, there is the upper body and profile of a spear-holding warrior, which some believe to be a depiction of a Greco-Bactrian, given the Hellenistic facial features and headband that is reminiscent of the diadem. It is also equally likely that this figure is intended to be Iranian in origin based upon his clothing, which is more akin to the dress of the Saka or Sogdians during this time. We can positively assert that there was a reasonable degree of Hellenistic influence in the material culture of the Tarim Basin, facilitated primarily by trade and the elite of nomadic groups like the Saka. But is there any firmer evidence of direct Hellenistic influence? Perhaps the most iconic representation of classical Chinese art are the many terracotta statues often simply known as the Terracotta Army. Discovered in the 1970s near Xi'an and the Shaanxi province, the Terracotta Army is a collection of thousands of highly detailed life-size statues, each uniquely designed using a series of interchangeable templates to portray figures from the military, including common soldiers and officers to musicians and horses. Originally pigmented, exposure to air and moisture has since removed most traces of color, and has left them with a greenish-brown hue. The army was buried within the mausoleum of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, in the late 3rd century, who presumably intended to bring his host to the afterlife in much the same fashion as had been done by the Egyptian pharaohs. The beauty and detail of these statues have drawn the attention of millions, but some scholars have also noted similarities between them and the sculpture work of the Hellenistic period. A controversial paper by researcher Lucas Nickel has suggested that the creation of these terracotta warriors may have been inspired by the importation of Hellenistic goods into China during the time, namely life-size bronze statues. The reasoning behind this operates under the principle that earlier Chinese sculptures tended not to portray human or animal figures, and when they did, they were heavily stylized or possessed simple features. Yet in the time of Qin Shi Huangdi, we suddenly get highly realistic and anatomically proportioned statues that are produced by the thousands, without much in the way of transitory works showing the development of this process. This outburst of production does line up with the arrival and proliferation of Greek culture in Bactria during this period. Additionally, Nickel points to 2 passages in Chinese texts that may document this transition. After his unification of China, Qin Shi Huangdi is said to have collected all the bronze weapons of his enemies, melted them down, and cast them into 12 large bronze figures, seemingly depicting human beings. According to the Han Shu, these statues were said to be based on giants that appeared in the westernmost region of Lintao near the Gansu corridor, which wore foreign robes. A comparison is drawn between these 12 giants and the 12 large altars of the Olympic pantheon set up by Alexander the Great at the banks of the Hyphasis River in India to mark the end of his journey, and how these designs may have spread by merchants traveling from South Asia to China. While I find the connection between Alexander's altars and the giants of Lintao to be a tenuous one, I do think it is somewhat plausible that Hellenistic goods like statues or figurines could have made their way through the Tarim Basin and inspired local Chinese artists. But the Chinese imperial system was incredibly talented at mobilizing tens of thousands of craftsmen for large projects such as the Tomb of the Emperor, so this influence, I think, is a limited one at best. However, we do know that Greek-inspired art did in fact make its way to East Asia. A bronze statuette was discovered in the Kanas River in Xinjiang, showing a kneeling warrior, which altogether is not that odd. What is unusual about this find is that the warrior is wearing a helmet that looks almost identical to the so-called Phrygian design, with a raised peak at the top that arches forwards. This equipment type was extensively employed by Greco-Macedonian troops both during and after the time of Alexander. It was almost certainly brought to Bactria with the arrival of his army, and was probably worn to some degree by the troops stationed there afterwards. Another example is a rather strange collection of 5 discs discovered in Gansu, each approximately the size of a coin. On the front of these discs are some sort of 3-branch pattern, but on the reverse is what appears to be Greek script encircling the rim. The Greek itself is very muddled, and it is believed that local craftsmen were attempting to copy inscriptions that they may have seen on Greco-Bactrian or later Parthian coins. This is probably quite similar to the medieval European phenomenon of pseudo-Kufic, whereby artists would copy Arabic script for aesthetic purposes without understanding what the word or phrase meant. Dating this find is problematic, as it could very well have been from the Greco-Bactrian period in the 2nd century BC to the Kushan period in the late 1st century AD. but it does show how the Chinese were exposed to Greek writing to some extent or another. More significant than small trinkets or wayward goods was the arrival of Buddhism. By 100 AD, Buddhists began practicing in China, and they brought along with them the image of the Buddha that was cultivated in Gandhara. We will discuss Gandharan Buddhist art later, but suffice it to say that there was a strong Greco-Roman influence on the conception of the humanoid Buddha, and perhaps other figures in Buddhist mythology as well. These would have been brought to China through the trade networks leading from Gandhara through Central Asia and the Tarim Basin. While not tied directly to our period, there is also one interesting remnant of the Hellenistic world that made its way to China. The Seleucid era, the dating system used by the eponymous Seleucid dynasty, had been conceived in the late 4th, early 3rd century BC, as the world's first continuously linear measurement of time. It had fallen out of practice with the independence of the Greco-Bactrian kings, who established their own eras, but it saw a reintroduction into Central and East Asia, thanks to its use by Nestorian Christians. Gravestones from the 14th century AD in Kazakhstan and as far as Quanzhou in eastern China show epitaphs still counting the era nearly 1700 years after its creation. Following the campaigns of Wu Di, the Chinese began to develop an interest in certain Western goods and products. For Wu Di, the most important were the horses of Fergana, but there were others as well. It is said that the emperor was eager to display the crops of the West in his palace gardens, namely grapes. Though Chinese winemaking had existed prior to the Han period, it was through the byproduct of grains rather than grapes, the latter of which were acquired from Dayuan and Dasha, areas that Strabo noted as being excellent places for planting the vine. And it would be surprising if Sogdian viniculture was not aggressively expanded to meet the demands of the wine-loving Greek settlers. The term used by Zhang Chen for grapes is putao, which may be a transliteration of the Greek word botrytis, referring to a bunch of grapes. While China was able to benefit from Central Asian imports, they came out on top of the mercantile exchange thanks to their most important export, silk. Sericulture, or the production of silk, was practiced by the Chinese for centuries, if not millennia, prior to their arrival in Bactria. Its creation is due to Bombyx mori, a domesticated moth species cultivated through generations of artificial selection that has left them blind and incapable of flight. The moths lay hundreds of eggs which hatch into small silkworms that feed on mulberry trees. As they approach their pupa stage, they secrete a fibrous protein filament that envelops them in a cocoon that would normally enable their transformation into adulthood. Unfortunately for the larvae, their exit from their self-made enclosure involves the release of an enzyme that destroys the silk, so harvesters gather these cocoons up and place them into boiling water before they emerge. This process kills the silkworm, but it allows the sericulturalist to unravel the thread, which can be as long as 1 mile in length. While it sounds like a lot of material from a single filament, upwards of 2,500 cocoons were required to make just 1 pound of silk. This is certainly a labor-intensive process, but the qualities of silk made it well worth the effort. Lightweight and durable, it was used for a variety of applications, though most prominently as a textile to produce clothing. In terms of aesthetic value, Chinese silk absorbed dyes very well, and created a rich shimmer and sheen that was unmatched by any other clothing material known to the ancient world. For this reason, it was often the most sought-after Chinese product. Sericulture was a common practice among the women of rural Chinese households, but the government recognized that it was a powerful tool for administration and diplomacy. Unlike precious metals like gold and silver, silk is a renewable resource, a problem for consumers that was recognized by later Roman authors like Pliny the Elder. Silk was viewed as an acceptable form of payment for taxes, and the government oversaw industrial workshops to facilitate the large-scale production. It could be used as wages to pay laborers and troops, but bales of silk were often included in the gifts to the nomads, intended either as bribes to gain their loyalty, or deliver tribute to the more intimidating figures like the Zhongnu Chanyu. Sericulture was also practiced in the Mediterranean prior to contact with China, specifically on the island of Kos. Chinese silk was far superior in quality, however, and was priced significantly higher than anything locally made. Increasingly, the Mediterranean world, primarily fueled by Roman aristocrats, began to demand greater amounts of this eastern import. A flourishing trade network soon began to develop as a result, what the 18th century German scholar Ferdinand von Richthofen called the Silk Road. The concept of a Silk Road is entirely a modern one, and something that was not necessarily recognized by any of the peoples that took part in it. Images of caravans carrying goods across Eurasia in an unbroken line from China to the Mediterranean have captured the imagination of many, but this is a romantic perception. It might be better to understand it as a series of overlapping trade networks, where each member may have only dealt directly with one or two links in the economic chain. Some dismiss the idea outright, but many scholars continue to champion the idea of a Silk Routes era, which I believe more accurately captures the notion of what really happened. Eurasia saw an outburst of long-distance connectivity and trade between the 1st century BC until the 3rd century AD, precipitated by the relative stability of the four main empires, Roman, Parthian, Kushan, and Han Chinese, but the various kingdoms of India and the Central Asian nomads were major players in this network as well. For the Mediterranean world during this time, the bulk of their imports came through maritime trade through the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean rather than overland routes, a topic of great importance that will be discussed later in this series. Still, silk was an extremely sought-after commodity that was mainly carried through the markets of India to Roman traders, who returned to Alexandria and Egypt with their cargo. Once acquired, the Chinese silk was employed for a wide variety of purposes, ranging from fashionable women's clothing to banners and awnings for the ostentatious display at the Colosseum. Not all were particularly happy at the introduction of this foreign treasure. Conservative Roman authors lamented the apparent moral decline brought about by the large-scale importation of foreign silk. For men, it represented a debasement of character and softness, while for women it left them over-sexualized and devoid of any modesty. How much did the Greeks and Romans know about the Chinese? It's difficult to say that the Mediterranean world knew explicitly about the existence of China, but the common name that is associated with them is Seres, a Latin term meaning silk people, those who lived in the lands of Serica, which could be used to apply to all peoples of East Asia wherever silk was produced. Like with the early Greek reports of India, descriptions of the Seres head into the fantastical. The geographer Strabo and the poet Lucian say that they lived for over 200 years, though Strabo fully acknowledges that this claim is entirely due to the ignorance brought about by the great distance and lack of concrete information. Other accounts suggest a near utopia, a prosperous region of just laws that rivaled or exceeded that of their own. In his description of Bactria, Strabo believed that the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom at its height bordered the lands of the Seres, which may be more of a literary device to exaggerate the size of the kingdom than any sort of serious understanding of the location of China. Many times they are placed within the general geographic space of India and Scythia, which is not an outlandish characterization, but does contextualize how Serica was used in a similar fashion as Timbuktu or the North Pole are in English idioms, a place that can be generally equated to the furthest ends of the earth. As one moves into the 1st century AD, there is more concrete evidence thanks to the increased travel of Roman merchants to the Indian Ocean. The author of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, who presumably wrote down his own observations, refers to a land called Thyna. Merchants from Thyna transport silk from the Tarim Basin into Gujarat and sail along the Ganges to deliver their wares. Our writer says that few actively made this journey given its peril, and expresses a vague ignorance about the lands beyond India, stating that the vicious cold and storms prevent any further exploration. Shortly after the time of the Periplus, the geographer Ptolemy also associates the name Thyna with the Seres, as it appears that the term may have derived from Sanskrit renditions of Chin. Are there any recorded meetings between the Chinese and Mediterranean world? Though Zhang Qian is the most important Chinese envoy to the West for our purposes, he was certainly not the last, nor did he travel the farthest. Other embassies were sent to the Mediterranean throughout the next few centuries. Given their closer proximity, China was much more knowledgeable about Parthia, Angxi. At about the same time as the War of the Heavenly Horses, Shima records a meeting at either the city of Hecatompylos or Parthava between representatives of the Han government and the Parthian king Mithridates II, along with a host of 20,000 Parthian horsemen. Gifts were exchanged, and several Parthian officials were sent to the court of the Han on the return trip. By the 1st century BC, the Chinese became aware of the lands of the Da Qin, meaning Great China, more specifically, the Roman Empire. Another term used to describe the Roman Empire is Lijiang, a name that some scholars believe to be a transliteration of Alexandria. Chinese historians and geographers probably did not understand what Rome really was, and their interpretations are about as fantastical as the observations of the Greco-Roman authors on the Ceres. Rome itself is described as over 40 kilometers in diameter, with 5 palaces spread across the city that the king would visit to conduct his affairs. These kings would be overseen by a council of 36, possibly the Roman Senate, and if their performance was deemed inadequate, then a new leader could be elected. A rather whitewashed perception of the government of Imperial Rome, but not completely out of the realm of reality. Like with Central Asia, the Chinese were also interested in the various goods of what Da Qin had to offer: ivory, gemstones, coral, glassware, and dyed clothing. These are all described in the Periplus, products that could be acquired as sailors traveled through the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Western Indian Ocean. Indirect trading partners aside, there were efforts by both civilizations to try and establish some sort of contact. An envoy named Gan Ying was ordered to get in touch with the Da Qin in roughly 97 AD. Gan Ying is said to have ultimately ended his journey at the city-country of Tiaoxie. Zhang Qian also referred to Tiaoxie, and in that context it roughly approximated Mesopotamia and eastern Iran. But this was information passed by hearsay. In Gan Ying's case, Tiaoxie was a large site that was on the border of Parthia, approximately 17 kilometers in diameter, and adjacent to a body of water known as the Western Sea. At this point, the envoy wished to sail through the Western Sea from Tiaoxie to Da Qin, but was apparently told by Parthian sailors that the journey could take years, and was extremely perilous due to the great size of the ocean, which led Gan Ying to call off his expedition and return back to China. Based on the description, it has been argued that Tiaoxie refers to either Antioch in Syria along the Orontes River and the Mediterranean, or the city of Charax-Spasinu, Karakin, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, with the latter appearing to be the most likely option. In either case, such a voyage would certainly not take as long as what was being told to him. Perhaps Gan Ying simply mistranslated, or perhaps the sailors were trying to scare the inexperienced Gan Ying into accepting a higher cost for the voyage. A more conspiratorial angle suggests that the Parthians did not wish to lose their profitable positions as intermediaries, and sought to prevent the Romans and Chinese from ever making actual contact, a belief that was remarked by the Chinese themselves. According to the Epitomus Florus, Augustus Caesar received ambassadors from Serica shortly after becoming emperor, though the exact details of this event are not given, and neither Augustus himself nor the Chinese talk about such a mission ever taking place. But there are a few pieces from both Greco-Roman and Chinese accounts that hint at further attempts. In his research, the geographer Ptolemy was said to have relied on information from a previous author named Marinus of Tyre, who in turn used a report compiled by a Syrian merchant of Macedonian descent named Maius Titianus. According to the story, Maius funded an expedition in the late 1st century AD to get in contact with the Ceres. Starting from Syria, he and his party traveled overland through Mesopotamia and Iran, before ultimately ending up in Bactria. From there, Maius' expedition journeyed towards the Pamir Mountains, where they stopped at a location known as the Stone Tower. The Stone Tower was situated at the border of Chinese territory, but the details of Maius' expedition are not elaborated on further, though he may have the distinction of being the furthest documented roving traveler on an overland route. Another important event occurs a few decades after Maius' expedition, the so-called Andun Embassy. The Hu Hanshu reports that during the 9th year of the Emperor Huan of Han, approximately 166 AD, officials from the military station at Renan in modern Vietnam reported that foreigners had traveled to contact the emperor. This group, described as an embassy, were said to have come on behalf of an Andun of Da-Qin, bringing tribute to establish former relations between their leader and the Han. After traveling nearly 1,200 miles overland to the capital of Luoyang, they were able to meet with the emperor and presented him with their gifts. These goods, a paltry collection of ivory and turtle shells, did little to impress Huan, who was no doubt disappointed that the legends of the fabulously wealthy Da-Qin on the other side of the world were seemingly untrue. Who was Andun? It is generally accepted that Andun is intended to be the Roman name Antoninus, more specifically, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the adopted son of the previous Emperor Antoninus Pius. The motivations behind this Sino-Roman meeting are unclear, as there is no report from any of our classical sources of such an expedition. It has been theorized that the travelers were Roman merchants on an independent venture, as it would explain why their gifts were so minimal. Many of these goods could be acquired en route from the Red Sea as described by the Periplus, but funds may have run out by the time they arrived in Vietnam. Curiously, Ptolemy's geography speaks of a land past India known as the Golden Peninsula, which is thought to be a description of the Thai-Malay Peninsula, so it may lend credibility to the idea that Roman traders were somewhat aware of Southeast Asia by the early 2nd century AD, but it is quite possible that this was intended to be an official diplomatic overture on behalf of the Roman government. Shortly before these travelers must have set out on their voyage, a war between Rome and Parthia had erupted in 161 that saw the armies of Marcus Aurelius and his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, reach Babylonia. It could well be the case that this was intended as a mission to seek some sort of alliance, or more likely establish contact during a conflict that very well may have seen the end of the Parthian Empire, which would make it even more important to establish relations should the Romans continue to occupy Mesopotamia. But the war had already concluded by 166, and the Romans were forced to leave the Parthians intact and retreat to the Mediterranean. Ironically, the end of the Parthian War and the Andun embassy also coincided with the outbreak of the Antonine Plague, what is believed to be the first serious outbreak of smallpox in Europe, and the world's first pandemic. This resulted in the death of nearly 20% of the Roman population, and the global trading network would be thrown into disarray by the early 3rd century, thanks to events such as the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, the collapse of both the Parthian and Kushan empires, and the Three Kingdoms period in China. A few brief records here and there suggest some wayward Roman merchants made it to Southeast Asia, but it appears that there were no more concerted efforts on behalf of the governments of the Roman or Chinese empires to contact each other until the period of late antiquity several hundred years later. So concludes our discussion on Sino-Greek and Sino-Roman relations. We will continually rely on the Chinese historians as we move into the second half of our series, but our attention must be turned back to our period in question. While the Greco-Bactrian realm may have collapsed, their contemporaries in India were still thriving. Let us return to the campaigns of Demetrius I as we discuss the rise of the Indo-Greek kingdoms.